Hello, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we dive into the gripping story of Operation Valkyrie, the audacious plan to overthrow Hitler and save Europe from catastrophe. Join me as we uncover every dramatic detail of the plot that came within a heartbeat of rewriting history. The morning of July 20th, 1944 began like any other at the Wolf's Lair. Adolf Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters buried deep in the East Prussian forest. Yet the air felt heavier than usual, charged with an unspoken tension that pressed against the skin like the humid summer heat. Officers' aides and stenographers shuffled about the map-lined conference room, their uniforms damp with sweat, as Hitler stalked the space like an irritable predator. He barked sharp criticisms at his generals, his piercing gaze slicing through them as he railed against suggestions of retreat. Outside, pine branches drooped in the oppressive warmth. Inside, the stale air carried the faint metallic scent of stress and fear. Among those gathered was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, tall, elegant, and battle-scarred, a decorated veteran who had lost an eye and a hand to war, but not his conviction. His remaining hand clutched a hefty leather briefcase, its weight far greater than its appearance suggested. Within lay the instrument of a nation's desperate hope, a bomb packed with enough explosives to change history. Stauffenberg's heart beat with an almost supernatural steadiness. Months of planning, endless nights of quiet resolve, and the prayers of countless Germans yearning for liberation hung in the balance. Today could be the day the nightmare ended. The conference droned on as Hitler jabbed a finger at the vast Eastern Front map spread across the table. Stauffenberg eased closer, every movement measured. He lowered the briefcase beneath the massive oak table, nudging it near Hitler's usual position. The ticking of his pocket watch seemed deafening in the hush of anticipation. With a polite nod, Stauffenberg excused himself, claiming an urgent call from Berlin. His voice betrayed no tremor as he stepped from the room and into the scorching daylight. Behind him, the innocuous leather case hummed with lethal potential. Inside, Colonel Heinz Brandt shifted uncomfortably, the briefcase pressed awkwardly against his foot. Annoyed, he bent slightly and nudged it aside just a few inches, a small, almost thoughtless act born of irritation and an itch to sneeze. That simple adjustment would become one of the most consequential movements of the entire war. Minutes later, the world ripped open. A thunderous explosion shattered the humid air, blasting shards of wood, metal, and earth into a violent storm. The conference room convulsed in chaos as a fireball roared outward, splintering the oak table and tearing through plastered walls. Smoke billowed into the corridor while echoes of the blast rolled through the surrounding forest, startling guards and birds alike. Cries of pain mingled with the ringing in stunned ears. Flames licked the wreckage as soldiers scrambled for cover, their faces ashen and disbelieving. Dust and smoke blurred the outlines of figures staggering from the inferno. For a breathless moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. Had it worked? Could the tyrant truly be gone? In Berlin, telephones crackled to life as conspirators waited for the signal. Operation Valkyrie, the meticulously plotted plan to seize control of the Reich, was to be set in motion the instant confirmation arrived of Hitler's death. In the tense silence that followed the explosion, hope flickered like a fragile candle. Decades of militarism and dictatorship might at last be severed in a single stroke. Stauffenberg, already en route back to Berlin, believed the impossible had been achieved. He imagined a nation awakening from a nightmare, the SS disarmed, the Gestapo dismantled, and the war brought to an end before Germany crumbled entirely under the Allied advance. As the car bounced along forest roads, he rehearsed the next move: secure the reserve army, arrest key Nazi officials, and broadcast the news that the Führer was dead. But history, like fate, rarely yields so easily. Incredibly, Hitler survived. Brandt's seemingly trivial repositioning of the briefcase had shielded him just enough. Shrapnel tore through the room, killing and maiming officers. Yet Hitler staggered from the blast, battered but alive, his trousers singed, eardrums ringing, but his will unbroken. His survival was at once miraculous and catastrophic for the conspirators. Within minutes, he was dictating orders, his rage cold and precise. Still, in those early confused hours, the conspirators in Berlin clung to their belief in success. Telegraphs hummed encoded messages leapt across wires. The wolf's lair was in ruins, Hitler presumed dead. General Friedrich Ulbricht and other plotters in the capital activated Operation Valkyrie, mobilizing the replacement army to secure government buildings and arrest high-ranking Nazis. Major Otto Ernst Raymer led troops to surround the propaganda ministry, while couriers spread the narrative that Hitler had fallen to treachery from his own circle. For a fleeting span, Berlin trembled on the edge of transformation. Soldiers hesitated, unsure which orders to trust. Civilians whispered in the streets, sensing something monumental afoot. Across occupied Europe, underground resistance networks held their breath, wondering if Germany might finally break free from its self-imposed darkness. Yet the shadow of Heinrich Himmler and his ruthless SS stretched long. At first unaware of the full plot, Himmler quickly grasped the magnitude of what was unfolding. The Reich's vast machinery of surveillance and repression whirred to life. Within hours, the Gestapo seized radio stations, choking off the conspirators' communications. Loyal SS officers fanned out through Berlin, occupying strategic points and sowing confusion among wavering troops. General Friedrich Fromm, torn between duty and survival, sensed the shifting winds. Once complicit, he now feared the wrath of a still-living Hitler. In a desperate bid to save himself, he ordered the arrest of Stauffenberg and the principal conspirators. Shots cracked in the dark courtyard of the Bendler block as Stauffenberg and his closest allies faced the firing squad, their final words drowned by the bark of rifles. The coup collapsed in less than a day. News of Hitler's survival spread like wildfire, carrying with it a bitter chill. The dream of a Germany freed from tyranny had slipped through trembling fingers. For many, the failure felt like destiny's cruel joke, a near miracle undone by a single careless nudge of a briefcase. Still, the explosion at the wolf's lair sent ripples far beyond the bloodied walls. It revealed that even within Hitler's inner circle, defiance burned. It proved that not all Germans marched willingly beneath the swastika, that courage could flourish in the darkest soil. The attempt seared itself into memory as a symbol of moral resistance, a spark of honor amid a war of horrors. As night fell over Berlin, the streets grew silent again. The SS tightened its grip. The Gestapo compiled its lists. Across Europe, those who had dared to hope retreated into the shadows. Yet the echo of the blast at Rastenburg lingered, a deafening reminder that even the most unassailable tyrants can be shaken, if only for a moment, by the resolve of the brave. Long before that sweltering July morning, the roots of Operation Valkyrie had been taking shape in the dark soil of Germany's growing disillusionment. The conspiracy did not spring from sudden outrage, but from years of slow, agonizing recognition that Hitler's war was both morally indefensible and strategically doomed. By 1943, the tide of the conflict had turned. Stalingrad's smoldering ruins and the Allies' relentless advance from North Africa signaled that the Third Reich's dream of continental domination was collapsing. For many German officers, men raised on Prussian discipline and nationalist pride, Hitler's recklessness threatened not only Germany's honor, but its very survival. Among these officers were a diverse cast of patriots and pragmatists, aristocratic Prussian generals, conservative politicians, devout Christians, and quiet social democrats. They shared little except a grim consensus: Hitler had to be removed for Germany to endure. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, whose calm audacity would one day carry the briefcase bomb, embodied this convergence of ideals. Wounded grievously in North Africa, he returned from the front convinced that Hitler's obsession with total war would lead only to national annihilation. His Catholic faith and patrician upbringing instilled in him a belief that duty to the nation could mean defiance of its leader. These conspirators formed a shadowy coalition that spanned Germany's fractured political spectrum. Former diplomats such as Ulrich von Hassel mingled with high-ranking officers like General Ludwig Beck, once chief of the Army General Staff. Civilian resistors, jurists, intellectuals, and even a handful of courageous clerics lent moral weight to the endeavor. They met in secluded villas, whispered in candlelit studies, and drafted secret memoranda beneath the eyes of a pervasive secret police. To be discovered meant torture and death. yet their resolve hardened as the Reich's fortunes waned. The question was never simply whether to act, but how. Assassination attempts against Hitler had already failed with almost mythical regularity. Bombs had fizzled, fuses misfired, and chance had preserved the dictator time and again, feeding a legend of invincibility that chilled would-be plotters. A direct attack required not only precision but a plan to seize control of the government the instant Hitler fell. Otherwise, chaos would invite civil war or an SS bloodbath. Here, the conspirators found their unlikely instrument, a bureaucratic contingency known as the Replacement Army Emergency Plan. Originally drafted to stabilize the Reich, if Allied bombs or uprisings paralyzed communications, the plan, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, authorized the Reserve Army to secure key government sites, disarm the SS, and maintain order. On paper, it was a safeguard for Hitler. In secret, it became the dagger aimed at his heart. With careful edits and forged authorizations, the plotters transformed Valkyrie from a defensive measure into a blueprint for regime change. The strategy was elegant in its audacity. Kill Hitler announced that rogue SS units had attempted a coup and invoke Valkyrie to place the reserve army under the control of the conspirators. Within hours, Berlin's ministry's communication hubs and broadcasting stations would be occupied. High-ranking Nazis would be arrested before they could rally loyal forces. A provisional government led by respected figures like General Beck and former Leipzig mayor Karl Friedrich Goerdeler would sue for peace with the Western Allies, hoping to preserve a sovereign Germany and stave off Soviet conquest. But even as the plan crystallized, danger seeped into every conversation. The Gestapo's web was vast. A careless word at a dinner party could doom an entire circle. Some officers recoiled from outright treason, clinging to the military oath to Hitler despite misgivings. Others feared that killing the Führer might fracture Germany into civil war or invite Soviet occupation. Weeks became months as meetings dragged late into the night, conspirators weighing not only logistics but their very souls. By early 1944, with Allied troops massing in Britain and the Red Army grinding westward, hesitation gave way to grim necessity. Stauffenberg's charisma and steely efficiency propelled the conspiracy forward. His war wounds, an empty right sleeve, and a black eye patch lent him the aura of a man already tempered by sacrifice. He secured the confidence of General Friedrich Olbricht, who controlled the replacement army's communications, and of Major General Henning von Treschow, whose own earlier attempts to assassinate Hitler had narrowly failed. Together, they refined the Valkyrie orders, inserting secret clauses that, when activated, would place the reserve army at their command. Key targets were meticulously cataloged. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, and Hitler's designated successor must be neutralized. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, had to be silenced lest he rouse the nation with a single broadcast. And then there was Heinrich Himmler, the chilling architect of the SS and the Holocaust. Some conspirators, in a desperate calculus, even contemplated courting Himmler himself. Perhaps they reasoned he could be convinced to abandon Hitler and negotiate with the Allies to save Germany from ruin. Conservative Prussian finance minister Johannes Popitz discreetly floated the idea of offering Himmler political support if he turned against the Führer. But Himmler, ever calculating, played his own game. Listening, probing, never committing, while quietly alerting his SS network to the scent of conspiracy. These outreach efforts were perilous gambles. Any hint of betrayal could mean sudden arrest and the dreaded knock of the Gestapo at midnight. Yet they underscored the conspirators' realism. Killing Hitler alone would not suffice. The entire Nazi hierarchy had to be paralyzed in the same heartbeat, or else the SS would rally and drown Germany in an even bloodier purge. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Berlin thickened with paranoia. Ration lines lengthened, Allied bombers prowled the skies, and whispers of impending defeat seeped into every neighborhood cafe. Soldiers home on leave spoke in low tones of hopeless battles on the eastern front of Soviet armies, pushing inexorably toward the Reich's borders. Ordinary Germans, though cowed by years of propaganda, sensed that the tide was turning. The conspirators hoped to harness that quiet despair to present themselves not as traitors, but as saviors acting to spare the nation total destruction. By June 1944, the urgency became almost unbearable. The Allied landings in Normandy signaled the beginning of the end. In private moments, Stauffenberg confided that each day's delay cost thousands of German lives and left Europe more firmly in Allied hands. He pressed for immediate action, arguing that a bold strike, however risky, was the only path left. "It is now a question of whether we can end the war and save Germany," he told his confidants, "or whether Germany will be destroyed." Final preparations unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Explosives were smuggled and disguised detonators tested and retested. False orders were drafted to redirect reserve army units at the crucial moment. Messages to sympathetic commanders were encoded, ready to flash across telegraph lines the instant confirmation of Hitler's death arrived. Every contingency was considered, except perhaps the unpredictable hand of chance. Yet even as the plan reached readiness, its architects understood the enormity of what they attempted. To assassinate the head of state and overthrow the government was the ultimate act of treason under German law, punishable by death, not only for the plotters, but often for their families. They wrestled with moral torment. Was it murder or salvation? Could the killing of one man redeem the suffering of millions? Their diaries and letters reveal not the cold calculation of conspirators, but the anguished reflections of patriots who believed that obedience had become sin. In quiet moments, Stauffenberg prayed. He thought of his children, of the Germany he hoped they might inherit, a nation freed from the madness of racial hatred and endless war. He knew the odds were long, the danger immense, but to do nothing, he believed, was to forfeit both honor and country. By mid-July, the decision was sealed. The briefcase bomb was prepared. The Valkyrie orders finalized, the reserve army primed. Only the opportunity remained. When word reached Stauffenberg that Hitler would convene a conference at the Wolf's Lair on July 20th, he recognized destiny's call. The time for deliberation was over. History would pivot on a single explosion or on the cruel whim of fate. To strike at Hitler was only the first blade of a double-edged operation. The conspirators also had to paralyze the entire Nazi command structure within the same heartbeat. A single death, however dramatic, would be meaningless if the Reich's other power brokers could rally the army and the dreaded SS. For this reason, the Valkyrie architects drew up a meticulous roster of secondary targets, each chosen for their ability either to seize control or to inspire resistance. At the top of that list stood Hermann Göring, the bombastic chief of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. Though his once mighty air force was already bleeding from the skies over Europe, Göring retained both legal authority and a dangerous charisma. Remove him, the planners reasoned, and the Nazi succession mechanism would shatter. Almost equally threatening was Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's master of words. In a state where propaganda had become oxygen, one fiery broadcast from Goebbels could transform the chaos of assassination into a clarion call for vengeance. And then there was Heinrich Himmler, the icy architect of the SS and the final solution. His black uniformed order was more than a secret police. It was an empire within the empire, with its own army intelligence networks and fanatical ideology. Neutralizing Himmler was imperative, yet some conspirators dared to imagine a subtler path. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could be seduced into turning on Hitler. Conservative financier Johannes Popitz, playing a perilous diplomatic game, quietly floated the idea that if Himmler helped overthrow the Führer, the opposition might support him in a post-Hitler government. It was a breathtaking gamble. Himmler, ever calculating, listened with his habitual, unreadable calm. He nodded, asked a few cool questions, and sent them away. Unknown to the envoys, the Reichsfuhrer already suspected treachery among the officer corps. He allowed the conversations to unfold, gathering intelligence like a spider testing the tremors of its web. Whether he truly considered a coup of his own or merely toyed with the notion as leverage, no one could say. What mattered was that these quiet overtures sowed a dangerous seed of awareness inside the SS. Every meeting, every whispered proposal was a dance on a razor's edge. The Gestapo's shadow stretched across every cafe and drawing room. A careless remark over schnapps, a betrayed confidence could summon the midnight knock that every German feared. Yet the conspirators pressed on, driven by a conviction that history itself demanded their defiance. They were not naive romantics. They understood the magnitude of their undertaking. But they also believed that to delay was to condemn millions more to death on battlefields and in concentration camps. Through the spring of 1944, the plot hardened into steel. Stauffenberg's magnetic presence fused disparate groups aristocrats like Beck devout Christians, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's circle pragmatic officers, like General Ulbricht into a single purpose. He moved with brisk efficiency, his maimed hand and eye patch a silent testament to sacrifice. Fellow conspirator Henning von Treschow, who had earlier smuggled explosives onto Hitler's plane in a failed attempt, provided both strategic insight and a quiet moral gravity. Together, they refined the Valkyrie orders with surgical precision, ensuring that once the signal was given, reserve army units would move without hesitation. Key ministries in Berlin were mapped like a battlefield. Couriers memorized routes to telegraph offices. Secretaries prepared forged orders bearing Hitler's own authorizing signature. The plan called for the immediate occupation of broadcasting stations, telephone exchanges, and government ministries. Crucially, SS units were to be disarmed before they could rally. Speed would be everything. Within hours of the blast, Berlin must appear under firm new authority, the population convinced that the reserve army was restoring order after an SS coup. But the planners knew that military speed alone could not secure victory. They also needed a compelling narrative. The public had to believe that the plotters were not traitors, but loyal Germans rescuing the Reich from internal chaos. Draft proclamations spoke of patriotic duty and the salvation of the fatherland language meant to resonate with soldiers and civilians alike. They envisioned posters plastered across the Capitol radio bulletins, interrupting evening music programs, and reserve army officers calmly assuring crowds that Hitler had fallen to his own fanatics and that lawful order was being restored. Still, anxiety gnawed at even the bravest hearts. Stauffenberg himself confessed to a confidant that every delay cost thousands of lives and eroded the chance of success. Yet he also understood that a single misstep, a premature order, a nervous recruit could unravel the entire enterprise. "We must kill him," Treschow declared, "and we must do it soon. He is the head, and the rest will die without it." In these clandestine meetings, morality and practicality tangled like barbed wire. Many of the officers had once sworn personal oaths to Hitler. To break them was to betray not just a man, but a sacred military tradition. Some worried that killing the Führer might ignite civil war or invite Soviet occupation. Others feared that without Hitler, the Allies would still demand unconditional surrender, leaving Germany humiliated and dismembered. Diaries from the period reveal nights of anguished debate. Was assassination murder, or the highest form of duty? Could the death of one man redeem the sins of an entire nation? Outside their secret circles, Germany itself groaned beneath the weight of impending defeat. Allied bombers turned cities into smoking rubble. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army surged westward, swallowing villages and entire divisions. Refugees clogged rail stations with haunted eyes and bundles of meager possessions. In Berlin, civilians queued for hours for bread as the air raid sirens wailed overhead. The war that Hitler had promised would bring glory now brought only ruin. By early July, the conspirators' sense of urgency became almost unbearable. The Allies had stormed ashore in Normandy, opening a second front that threatened to crush the Wehrmacht in a vice. Stauffenberg argued that each day's hesitation was a betrayal of Germany itself. "Every minute we wait," he warned, "costs lives and makes our task more difficult." His determination ignited the group, transforming dread into action. The final steps unfolded with almost obsessive care. Explosives were prepared and hidden within the innocuous shell of a British-made briefcase. Fuses were tested, detonators adjusted, and contingency signals rehearsed until they became second nature. The plan called for a single powerful charge, but Stauffenberg intended to arm a second as insurance if time permitted. Couriers memorized code phrases. Reserve Army commanders sympathetic to the cause were quietly alerted to expect sudden orders. Still, chance remained the invisible adversary. What if Hitler canceled a meeting? What if security inspections uncovered the bomb? What if an unforeseen delay gave the SS time to react? These questions hung over every whispered conversation like a storm cloud. Yet, as one conspirator later recalled, there comes a moment when action itself becomes the only refuge from fear. That moment arrived on the morning of July 20th. Word came that Hitler would convene a high-level conference at the Wolf's Lair to discuss the deteriorating Eastern Front. Stauffenberg recently appointed Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army, a position that gave him rare access to the Führer-recognized destiny summons. He arranged his travel with the calm precision of a soldier on parade, concealing beneath his impeccable uniform a bomb meant to rewrite history. Before departing, he met briefly with his wife, Nina. She sensed the gravity in his gaze but asked no questions. In her later recollection, he simply kissed her hand and said, "If our plans succeed, the world will see a different Germany. If not..." His voice trailed off heavy with unspoken finality. As the train carried him eastward through forests shimmering in the July heat, Stauffenberg contemplated the enormity of what lay ahead. He thought of his children, of the countless victims of Nazi terror, of a nation that might yet be spared total destruction. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails became a kind of prayer. Somewhere beyond the pine trees, history waited for the click of a detonator and the courage of a single man. The black pine forests of East Prussia whispered in the summer heat as Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg arrived once more at the Wolf's Lair on the morning of July 20th, 1944. He carried with him a battered leather briefcase that weighed far more than its appearance betrayed. Inside lay 2 blocks of British-made plastic explosive, a pencil detonator, and the collective hopes of a resistance that spanned army officers, conservative politicians, and disillusioned aristocrats. Months of secret meetings, coded telegrams, and sleepless nights now converged on this moment. Hitler's daily military conference was scheduled for late morning. Security at the Wolf's Lair was strict but familiar. Stauffenberg's high rank and new position as Chief of Staff to the replacement army granted him privileged access. His driver, Lieutenant Werner von Haften, carried a second charge ready if needed as the car jolted over the sandy track into the fortified complex. The humid air pressed down like a wet blanket, and the distant rumbles of artillery served as a reminder that the Eastern Front was collapsing under relentless Soviet pressure. Stauffenberg passed through layers of guards, his credentials unquestioned. The plan demanded perfect timing: arm the bomb, place the briefcase as close as possible to Hitler, and leave the room before detonation. Simple steps, yet each carried mortal risk. At the briefing hut, aides scurried with papers and maps, while a chorus of typewriters clattered in adjoining offices. The colonel's calm exterior belied the storm of calculations within: when to break the pencil detonator's vial of acid. How long would the fuse burn? Could he excuse himself without drawing suspicion? He and von Haften slipped into a small side room, ostensibly to adjust uniforms. Stauffenberg worked with his remaining hand to crush the detonator's glass capsule, releasing the acid that would eat through a thin wire and trigger the blast in about 10 minutes. Time slowed. Sweat traced lines down his temple as he struggled to arm the second charge. An effort thwarted by a sudden interruption, an officer entered to summon him to the meeting earlier than expected. Only one bomb could be primed. The margin for error narrowed to a knife's edge. The conference hut itself was a long wooden building with large windows flung open to ease the sweltering heat. Around a massive oak map table, Hitler and his generals examined troop movements on the Eastern Front. The air was heavy with the smell of pine resin and sweat. Stauffenberg entered the briefcase dangling casually from his left hand, his right sleeve pinned neatly to his tunic. He greeted the Führer with a slight bow, his voice steady. As Hitler launched into a tirade about the deteriorating situation in Belarus, Stauffenberg eased toward the table, sliding the briefcase beneath it near the Führer's usual position. A single motion so ordinary, so deliberate, carried the weight of destiny. He then requested to take an urgent telephone call from Berlin, a pretext rehearsed countless times. With a curt nod from General Keitel, he stepped into the corridor, heart hammering. Outside, the midday sun blazed. Stauffenberg walked briskly toward the guardhouse, each second stretching like an eternity. In the distance, birds chirped obliviously. Behind him, inside the hut, Colonel Heinz Brandt shifted uncomfortably. The briefcase pressed against his foot. Annoyed, he nudged it a few inches away, an act of casual irritation that would shape the fate of nations. At precisely 12:42 p.m., a thunderclap ripped through the forest. The explosion tore the conference hut apart, a geyser of flame and splintered wood, hurling men and debris into the air. Smoke billowed like a black banner against the pale sky. Windows shattered across the compound and guards rushed toward the scene as alarms wailed. Stauffenberg, already en route to the gate, turned briefly to see a column of dark smoke rising above the trees. He allowed himself a single thought: it is done. Believing Hitler dead, Stauffenberg and von Heften sped away in their staff car, racing toward the airfield and the next phase of the plan. They carried with them a single-minded certainty the tyrant had fallen. In Berlin, telephones buzzed as conspirators awaited the agreed-upon signal to activate Operation Valkyrie. General Friedrich Olbricht, charged with initiating the replacement army's takeover, hesitated only briefly before transmitting the first coded orders. The Valkyrie directive spread through the reserve army like an electric current. Units in Berlin received commands to secure government ministries, occupy broadcasting stations, and disarm SS contingents. Major Otto Ernst Riemer, a disciplined officer of the prestigious Guard Battalion, led troops to surround the propaganda ministry. Couriers dashed through the city carrying proclamations that the Führer had been assassinated by treacherous SS elements and that the army was restoring lawful order. For a few tense hours, the plan worked as envisioned. Confusion reigned in the capital. Some officers, unsure of the truth, obeyed the orders at face value. Civilians glimpsed soldiers in unfamiliar formations and whispered that Hitler was dead. In the conspirators' Bendler Block headquarters, a fragile hope bloomed. Stauffenberg, now back in Berlin, strode into the operations room with the calm authority of a man who believed he had just changed history. "The Führer is dead," he announced. "It is certain." Telegrams flashed outward asserting that the reserve army had assumed control. Across Germany, commanders loyal to the resistance began tentative moves to seize local authority. For a heartbeat, the coup seemed poised to succeed. Yet even in these triumphant first hours, ominous cracks appeared. Communications with the Wolf's Lair proved maddeningly inconsistent. Rumors filtered in that Hitler had survived, though none seemed credible to the conspirators who trusted Stauffenberg's eyewitness conviction. More troubling, the propaganda genius Joseph Goebbels remained at large in Berlin, his access to the state radio unbroken. A single broadcast from him could unravel the entire narrative. Then came the call that began to shatter the dream. From East Prussia, an officer loyal to Hitler phoned Major Riemer directly, insisting that the Führer still lived and demanding to speak with him. Riemer, confused but cautious, eventually found himself connected not to a mere staffer, but to Goebbels himself. In a calculated move, the propaganda minister handed the phone to Hitler, who spoke with icy clarity. "Major Riemer, do you recognize my voice?" Riemer did. The coup's carefully woven story of Hitler's death began to fray. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler and his SS moved with chilling efficiency. Having quickly confirmed the Führer's survival, Himmler launched a counteroffensive from his own headquarters, issuing orders to loyal forces to seize Berlin's critical infrastructure. Gestapo agents fanned through the city, arresting suspected conspirators and shutting down telegraph lines. Inside the Bendler Block, tension mounted as conflicting reports poured in. Stauffenberg maintained his certainty. He had seen the explosion, seen the devastation. But reality was shifting. General Friedrich Fromm, whose allegiance had always been ambivalent, sensed which way the wind was blowing. At first, he hesitated, hoping to gauge the true victor. Then, realizing that Hitler was alive and enraged, he turned on his fellow officers to save himself. By evening, Fromm ordered the arrest of Stauffenberg and the key plotters. A chaotic firefight erupted in the courtyard as loyalists stormed the headquarters. The dream of a new Germany collapsed in gunfire and shouted orders. In a final act of cold expediency, Fromm convened a drumhead court-martial and condemned the conspirators to death. Stauffenberg faced the firing squad with unflinching composure. As searchlights illuminated the dark courtyard, he cried out, "Long live Holy Germany!" before shots rang out, ending the life of the man who had come within inches of altering the century. By midnight, Operation Valkyrie was finished. The reserve army stood down its soldiers bewildered. Berlin slipped back under the suffocating control of the SS, and the Gestapo began a brutal purge that would claim thousands of officers, civilians, even distant relatives of the conspirators. The brief spark of hope had been extinguished, leaving only smoke grief and the knowledge of how narrowly history had missed a different path. The coup's fragile momentum dissolved almost as quickly as it had flared. What only hours earlier had seemed a daring stride toward liberation now unraveled in a tangle of fear-divided loyalties and the ruthless efficiency of Heinrich Himmler's SS. While Berlin still reeled from conflicting reports, Himmler acted with the instinct of a predator who senses weakness. His countermove would be as swift as it was merciless. Even before the smoke cleared in the wolf's lair, Himmler had begun issuing orders. The Reichsfuhrer of the SS understood that hesitation meant death not just for the conspirators, but for the regime itself. Using his vast network of Gestapo operatives and SS commanders, he activated a plan he called Reichssturm, or Empire Storm, designed to smash any internal revolt. His first priority was to strangle the conspirators' lines of communication. Radio transmitters and telegraph offices in Berlin were seized by SS squads, severing the channels through which the reserve army might rally nationwide support. At the same time, Himmler dispatched trusted officers to secure critical intersections and government buildings across the capital. Black-clad SS units fanned out with clinical precision, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. The sight of these disciplined columns' faces set weapons at the ready, spread panic among the wavering army detachments. Soldiers who only hours earlier had obeyed Operation Valkyrie's orders now hesitated, unsure whether to stand with the supposed new government or to yield to the iron authority of the SS. Goebbels, ever the opportunist, played his part to perfection. With Berlin's radio facilities now under tight control, he broadcast a steady stream of confident messages. The Führer lives. The traitors will be destroyed. His words, sharpened by years of propaganda mastery, cut through the uncertainty like a knife. Civilians who had murmured about Hitler's death only minutes before now retreated into silence. Officers who had dared to hope began to doubt. The psychological tide shifted in an instant. Inside the Bendler block, the conspirators felt the ground tilt beneath their feet. Couriers arrived breathless with news that Hitler himself had spoken to Major Reimer, the Guard Battalion commander, who had initially followed their orders. Reimer now demanded proof of legitimate authority. When Stauffenberg insisted the Führer was dead, his certainty rang hollow against the mounting evidence to the contrary. Tension thickened the air. General Friedrich Fromm, the very officer whose cooperation had been vital to the plan, sensed the peril of indecision. Ever cautious, he had played both sides during the long hours of uncertainty, hoping to align with the eventual victor. Now convinced of Hitler's survival, he moved to secure his own position. Barking orders to loyal troops, Fromm demanded the arrest of Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators, denouncing them as traitors. What followed was chaos. Shots echoed in the courtyard as army units loyal to Fromm clashed with the few defenders who remained steadfast to Valkyrie's vision. Stauffenberg, still unshaken in demeanor, refused to flee. Captured alongside Ulbricht Werner von Heften and Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, he faced a hastily convened drumhead court-martial. Fromm, eager to erase his own complicity, wasted no time. Within hours, he pronounced death sentences. The execution was brutal in its swiftness. Under the cold glare of searchlights, the men were led into the Bendler block courtyard. Stauffenberg stood tall, his eye patch stark against the dark. Witnesses recall that he cried out, "Long live sacred Germany," just before the rifles fired. His companions met their fate with equal dignity, their last words lost in the sharp retort of gunfire. Midnight had barely passed when their bodies slumped to the pavement, and with them the hope of a peaceful German revolution. Himmler's vengeance did not stop there. The Gestapo unleashed a relentless purge, arresting not only those directly involved, but also family members, distant associates, and anyone suspected of sympathy. Interrogations were savage, designed as much to terrorize the population as to extract information. Show trials followed their outcomes, foregone conclusions. The conspirators were hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison executions filmed for Hitler's private viewing. The message was unmistakable dissent would be crushed even unto the third generation. Yet, the Nazi hierarchy understood that this near miss exposed alarming cracks. That officers of the revered German army had plotted against the Führer shattered the myth of unanimous loyalty. Hitler's rage burned white-hot. He ordered sweeping arrests and demanded the restructuring of the Wehrmacht to ensure unflinching obedience. Trust between the army and the party was poisoned beyond repair. In the days that followed, Berlin seemed to tighten under an invisible fist. Posters denouncing the July 20th traitors appeared on street corners. Loudspeakers blared proclamations of Hitler's miraculous survival, casting him as a man chosen by Providence itself. For many ordinary Germans exhausted by war and wary of the Gestapo, the propaganda worked. Fear stifled any whisper of sympathy for the dead officers. The resistance's most daring effort became in the eyes of the regime a cautionary tale of treachery and divine deliverance. Meanwhile, the broader war ground on with relentless momentum. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces surged westward, threatening East Prussia itself. In the west, Allied armies pushed out of Normandy, driving toward Paris. Each passing week brought new defeats, new bombings, new reminders that the thousand-year Reich was crumbling. Yet paradoxically, the failed coup tightened Hitler's grip in the short term. Convinced of his invincibility, he demanded ever more fanatical resistance. Now, the German people know that Providence protects me, he boasted, a dark gleam in his eyes. Himmler capitalized on the moment to expand his own power. Presenting himself as the vigilant guardian of the Reich, he took command of vast new security operations. The SS absorbed even greater resources, while the Gestapo operated with near-total autonomy. Across occupied Europe, reprisals intensified. In France, partisans faced mass executions. In Poland, entire villages were razed in collective punishment. The Third Reich's machinery of terror, already brutal, grew more ferocious in the wake of July 20th. Within the German resistance, despair mixed with grim resolve. Surviving conspirators who evaded capture faced agonizing choices: continue the struggle or retreat into silence. Some attempted further small-scale sabotage, others fled or went into hiding. But the dream of a decisive military coup had died in the Bendler Block courtyard. Internationally, the failed plot stirred a more complex reaction. Allied leaders, while privately admiring the conspirators' courage, remained committed to unconditional surrender. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill doubted that any post-Hitler government, especially one led by military officers who had served the regime, would be fundamentally different in its ambitions. For Joseph Stalin, the coup only confirmed the necessity of crushing Germany utterly to prevent any resurgence. Still, the moral significance of the July 20th plot could not be erased. Word of the attempt filtered through underground channels to occupied nations, inspiring those who fought in shadows. In the years after the war, the names of Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Tresco, and their compatriots would stand as symbols of German conscience proof that not all had bowed to tyranny. For the moment, however, Berlin lay under a grim pall. The flicker of freedom had been extinguished, leaving only the harsh glow of SS floodlights and the echo of boots on cobblestones. Himmler's Reichssturm had succeeded where the conspirators had failed. In a single night, he consolidated the regime's power, silenced its most formidable internal enemies, and plunged the Reich deeper into the abyss of totalitarian terror. Beyond the capital ordinary, Germans sensed the tightening noose. Rumors of mass arrests and secret executions spread like wildfire, though few dared speak aloud. Families of accused officers disappeared overnight. Friends avoided their homes for fear of association. The regime's vengeance was not merely punitive, it was performative, designed to remind an exhausted populace that resistance meant annihilation. As the summer waned and Allied forces closed in from every direction, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, relying ever more on the SS and his inner circle. Meetings grew shorter, his rants longer, his faith in a miracle weapon or a sudden Allied collapse increasingly detached from reality. Yet the July 20th plot remained a constant refrain in his speeches proof. He claimed that he was chosen to lead Germany through an apocalyptic trial. The conspirators' failure paradoxically extended the war's agony. Their bold attempt might have shortened the conflict by months, perhaps saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Instead, their martyrdom stiffened the regime's resolve and gave Hitler the pretext for an even more repressive reign. By the time Berlin finally fell the following spring, entire cities lay in ruins and millions more were dead. But the echo of that brief, defiant day never entirely faded. Even amid the ruins, Germans would later look back to Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters as evidence that a different path had been possible, if only for a few trembling hours. Their courage, though thwarted, planted a seed of moral reckoning that would blossom in the democratic Germany yet to come. The night of July 20th bled into the early hours of the 21st with a kind of eerie stillness, as if Berlin itself was holding its breath after a day of chaos. Yet the echoes of gunfire and shouted orders from the Bendler Block courtyard still reverberated in the minds of those who had witnessed the swift destruction of Operation Valkyrie. The coup that had begun with a flash of defiance and a roar of ambition ended in a blur of floodlights, hasty trials, and the deafening crack of rifles. Within a single day, the hopes of the German resistance had been shattered, and the cost of that failure would reverberate across the Reich. Even as Stauffenberg's body lay cooling on the cobblestones, Himmler's Gestapo fanned outward like a dark tide. They raided homes, intercepted letters, and dragged suspects from their beds. Lists of potential conspirators had been quietly compiled long before the attempt. Now they became instruments of vengeance. Anyone with even a whisper of connection to the July 20th plot was arrested. Entire families, wives, children, distant cousins were swept into custody under the doctrine of Sippenhaft, the Nazi policy of collective punishment. Some disappeared into prisons and never emerged. The show trials began almost immediately at the notorious People's Court under the ghoulish judge Roland Freisler. These proceedings were less about justice than humiliation and terror. Defendants were berated, mocked, and interrupted as Freisler shrieked insults, his black robe swirling like the wings of a vulture. Sentences were a foregone conclusion. Many conspirators were hanged using thin piano wire, slowly strangled, while Hitler demanded the executions be filmed for his private viewing. The images, grisly pitiless, were intended to deter any lingering thoughts of resistance. For the broader German public, the failed coup became both a warning and a twisted affirmation of Nazi propaganda. Goebbels seized the opportunity to paint the conspirators as cowardly aristocrats and traitorous officers who had stabbed the nation in the back, while soldiers bled on the front lines. Posters plastered across cities denounced the July traitors. Radio broadcasts celebrated Hitler's miraculous survival, portraying him as a man protected by divine providence. Many ordinary citizens, fearful and weary after years of war, clung to this narrative. To doubt was to invite suspicion. To express sympathy was to risk death. Hitler himself emerged from the ordeal both physically scarred and spiritually hardened. His right arm trembled uncontrollably from injuries sustained in the blast, and his eardrums remained damaged. But rather than temper his resolve, the attack deepened his paranoia and messianic self-image. "Providence has spared me," he declared in a radio address, his voice hoarse but defiant. He vowed that vengeance would be merciless and total. In the days that followed, he purged the Wehrmacht of anyone suspected of disloyalty, replacing seasoned generals with zealots and tightening the already suffocating bonds between the Nazi Party and the military. This purge fractured the relationship between the German army and the regime it served. For years, the Wehrmacht had maintained a precarious independence from the Nazi Party, a remnant of Prussian military tradition. Now, after July 20th, the army was dragged deeper into the ideological machinery of the state. Officers were forced to renew their oaths of loyalty to Hitler personally. Informants reported even the mildest grumblings. Trust among soldiers eroded as fear of denunciation became pervasive. The very institution that had once harbored the hope of overthrowing the dictator was effectively broken. The international reaction was complex. Among the Allies, the coup's failure was greeted with a mix of admiration and cold realism. In London and Washington, officials acknowledged the bravery of the conspirators, but doubted that their success would have altered the demand for unconditional surrender. For Joseph Stalin, the attempt only underscored the necessity of absolute victory and the dismantling of the German state. Still, clandestine reports of the plot circulated through occupied Europe, inspiring resistance fighters in France, Poland, and beyond. The message was clear. Even within Hitler's inner sanctum, courage flickered. Yet within Germany, the human toll of the purge deepened. In addition to the officers executed in the immediate aftermath, hundreds of civilians were implicated. The Gestapo's dragnet extended to intellectuals, clergy, and anyone previously suspected of dissent. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian who had quietly supported the resistance, was among those eventually executed. The regime's cruelty was methodical. Not only would it destroy the bodies of its enemies, but it would attempt to erase their memory. Official records denounced them as traitors. Their families were left destitute. Meanwhile, the war outside Germany's borders accelerated toward its brutal conclusion. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies launched Operation Bagration, smashing Army Group Center and driving ever closer to Berlin. In the West, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and surged across France. The Reich was shrinking rapidly, its cities reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns. Yet Hitler, buoyed by the belief that destiny shielded him, demanded even greater sacrifices. He ordered the creation of the Volkssturm, a national militia that conscripted old men and teenage boys to defend the collapsing front lines. Total war became not just a slogan, but a grim reality. For many Germans, the failure of July 20th extinguished the last glimmer of internal salvation. If high-ranking officers and well-connected civilians could not remove Hitler, who could? Quiet despair settled over the population. Some turned inward, focusing only on survival as Allied bombs fell. Others doubled down on obedience, clinging to the illusion that loyalty might spare them the worst of what was to come. The Gestapo encouraged this climate of suspicion, rewarding informants and ensuring that neighbors watch neighbors with wary eyes. Yet paradoxically, the conspirators' sacrifice planted a seed that would endure beyond the war's end. In whispered conversations, the names of Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, and Tresckow became symbols of a different Germany, a Germany that had refused to bow completely to tyranny. After 1945, as the nation struggled to rebuild and reckon with its past, the memory of their courage offered a fragile foundation for moral renewal. Streets and schools would one day bear their names. July 20th would be honored not as a failure, but as proof that conscience survived even in the darkest times. Still, for those living through the immediate aftermath, such future vindication was unimaginable. In the months that followed, the Nazi state tightened every screw of repression. Himmler expanded the SS's reach, overseeing new offensives of terror across occupied Europe. In France, reprisals against partisans grew more savage. In Poland, entire villages were annihilated as warnings. Concentration camps swelled with fresh prisoners, their suffering a grim echo of the failed coup's consequences. Within the inner circle, Hitler's paranoia metastasized. He questioned the loyalty of his closest aides, suspecting plots even where none existed. Meetings became unpredictable rants, alternating between manic confidence and seething fury. The Führer, who had once mesmerized crowds, now appeared increasingly gaunt, a man consumed by his own myth. Yet his belief in ultimate victory through some miracle weapon or a sudden fracture among the Allies remained unshaken, a delusion that prolonged the war's agony. By early 1945, Germany was a nation on the edge of ruin. Cities lay in ruins, their inhabitants cold and starving. Refugees clogged every road as the Red Army advanced. Allied bombers darkened the skies over the Ruhr and Berlin. And still, the Gestapo hunted anyone suspected of disloyalty, a grim reminder of July 20th's aftermath. Resistance cells that once dreamed of coordinated action now focus solely on survival. The failure of Operation Valkyrie thus became both a turning point and a tragedy. It revealed the courage of those willing to defy a tyrant at the height of his power, but it also reinforced the iron grip of a regime determined to fight to the bitter end. In that single day of fire and gunfire, Germany's last best chance for an internal reckoning slipped away. What remained was a war that would rage until Berlin itself lay in ashes and the world counted its dead by the millions. And yet, as history would later affirm, the conspirators had not died in vain. Their stand, though crushed, testified to the enduring power of conscience. In the silence that followed their executions, a seed of moral resistance took root, one that would help Germany years later to confront its darkest legacy and to build a democracy founded on the hard-won lessons of that fateful July day. By the summer of 1944, with the July 20th plot extinguished and its conspirators silenced, the Third Reich entered its darkest and most fanatical phase. The failed assassination attempt confirmed every one of Hitler's deepest fears and fantasies, that betrayal lurked everywhere, and that Providence had chosen him for an apocalyptic mission. He interpreted his survival as a sign of divine favor, and with that twisted sense of destiny, he entrusted Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer of the SS, with unprecedented power. Himmler wasted no time turning fear into a governing principle. The SS, already a state within the state, became the primary engine of policy and terror. Under his command, the Gestapo broadened its surveillance to nearly every aspect of German life. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Children were encouraged to report the unpatriotic remarks of parents or teachers, and the casual conversations of cafes and tramcars grew cold and clipped. Fear, once a tool of politics, now defined existence itself. The regime doubled down on the ideology of total war. With the Wehrmacht bleeding on both the eastern and western fronts, Hitler demanded that every resource, every able body, every ounce of German willpower be devoted to a fight to the death. Armaments Minister Albert Speer organized frantic production drives while cities lay in rubble from relentless Allied bombing. Himmler, convinced that defeat would mean annihilation, exhorted the nation to sacrifice everything. Better that a generation of youth perish, he declared, than that Germany should fall. One of the most chilling manifestations of this fanaticism was the Volkssturm, a nationwide militia cobbled together from boys barely in their teens and men well past military age. Local Nazi officials herded school children into training grounds, thrusting rifles into hands that barely had the strength to lift them. Fathers and grandfathers, many of them veterans of the First World War, found themselves conscripted again, this time to fight hopeless battles against the onrushing Allies. Entire neighborhoods emptied as these ill-prepared units marched toward the front singing defiant songs, while mothers wept quietly at doorways. As the conventional German army faltered, Himmler poured men and money into the Waffen-SS, which now eclipsed the Wehrmacht in influence and resources. Divisions like the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, composed largely of teenagers indoctrinated since childhood, were thrown into desperate counterattacks. Their youthful ferocity often surprised Allied troops, but their sacrifices only delayed the inevitable. The regular army, increasingly resentful, watched in frustration as critical supplies were diverted to these ideologically driven formations. Perhaps the most sinister project of Himmler's post-July 20th rule was the expansion of the so-called werewolf program, a clandestine network of guerrillas trained to wage terror behind enemy lines. In speeches, Himmler portrayed these irregular fighters as the heirs of medieval Germanic warriors, a national phantom army that would bleed the occupiers long after an official surrender. Recruitment posters depicted shadowy figures slipping through forests with daggers drawn. Young recruits were promised a chance to avenge Germany's humiliation, and training camps in remote alpine valleys drilled them in sabotage, ambush, and assassination. The werewolves were taught to blend with civilian populations, striking suddenly and disappearing like ghosts. Their missions ranged from derailing Allied supply trains to assassinating newly installed local officials in occupied territories. Though the group never achieved the scale Himmler envisioned, isolated cells would indeed terrorize parts of Central Europe for years after the war's end, prolonging the chaos and fear that Nazi ideology had sown. While the SS expanded outward, its cruelty within the shrinking Reich intensified. Concentration camps grew even more lethal as resources dwindled and guards sought to obliterate evidence of atrocities. Inmates were forced on death marches westward as the Red Army approached, thousands collapsing from exhaustion or shot along frozen roads. Himmler oversaw new breeding programs meant to accelerate the creation of an Aryan elite, a grotesque attempt to salvage the racial fantasies of National Socialism even as Germany starved. Meanwhile, the Allied advance gathered speed. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces liberated France and pushed toward the Rhine. In the East, the Soviet juggernaut swept through Poland and the Baltic states, its artillery rumbling ever closer to the Reich's heart. Yet Hitler refused to contemplate surrender. Each defeat only deepened his obsession with final victory, or at least a cataclysm that would consume both friend and foe. He issued the Nero Decree ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure bridges, railways, factories, rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Inside, Berlin's Führer bunker paranoia thickened with the stench of stale air and impending doom. Hitler's health deteriorated. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, his gait grew stiff, and his once fiery speeches became rambling monologues. But he clung to the belief that miraculous wonder weapons such as the V-2 rocket or the jet-powered Me-262 fighter might yet reverse Germany's fate. Himmler fed these delusions, promising last-minute counterblows and secret negotiations that could divide the Allies. None of it could mask the inexorable collapse. Ordinary Germans bore the brunt of this final frenzy. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were bombed into moonscapes of smoking ruins. Food supplies dwindled to starvation levels. Refugees, millions of them, clogged roads as Soviet forces advanced their columns, stretching for miles, haunted by hunger and fear. Stories of atrocities committed by both retreating Nazis and vengeful Red Army soldiers spread terror across the countryside. In villages where werewolf units operated, reprisals by both German loyalists and advancing allies left civilians trapped between two merciless forces. Himmler himself grew increasingly erratic. While publicly projecting unshakable resolve, he secretly probed for a path to survival. He authorized intermediaries to make tentative peace offers to the Western allies, hoping to split them from the Soviets. These overtures were consistently rejected. Roosevelt and Churchill remained committed to unconditional surrender, and Stalin, wary of any separate peace, pressed ever harder from the East. Each rejection only deepened Himmler's desperation, but he never ceased plotting even as defeat loomed. Despite the terror and devastation, small sparks of resistance continued to flicker. Underground networks in occupied countries gained strength as the German military retreated. In the Netherlands, France, and Denmark, partisan fighters sabotaged rail lines and gathered intelligence for the Allies. Even within Germany, quiet acts of defiance persisted, priests sheltering fugitives, workers slowing production, students distributing clandestine leaflets. These were not the grand conspiracies of July 20th, but they testified to an enduring refusal to surrender the human spirit to fear. By early 1945, the Reich was a hollow shell held together only by the fanaticism of its leaders and the suffering of its people. Himmler's once formidable SS was stretched thin, its elite units mauled at the front, and its home guard increasingly composed of frightened youths and hardened ideologues. The werewolf program, touted as the seed of an eternal Nazi resistance, devolved into scattered bands committing acts of sabotage and occasional murder, but lacking the cohesion to alter the Allies' advance. Still, their attacks sowed chaos in the war's aftermath, particularly in the Alpine regions where dense forests and rugged mountains offered cover for months, even years. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine and the Soviets encircled Berlin, the end came with terrifying speed. Yet Hitler and Himmler remained defiant, demanding that every German fight to the last bullet. Cities were declared fortresses to be defended until the final man fell. In places like Breslau and Königsberg, these orders condemned tens of thousands to needless death. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had shriveled into a nightmare of ruins and mass graves. And still, Himmler's reign of terror lingered even beyond Germany's surrender. Small pockets of werewolf fighters continued assassinations and sabotage well into the late 1940s, targeting Allied soldiers, left-wing politicians, and returning Jewish survivors. The Alps and dense forests of Bavaria became their favorite haunts, where sporadic gunfire in the night reminded villagers that Nazi fanaticism had not been entirely extinguished. History would ultimately record these final months as a grim coda to the tragedy of July 20th. The conspirators' failure had not merely prolonged the war, it had allowed Himmler to unleash a reign of terror unmatched even by the earlier years of the Reich. The SS, empowered by paranoia and emboldened by Hitler's unyielding faith, drove Germany deeper into madness and ensured that the price of liberation would be measured in oceans of blood. Yet, within that darkness lay the faint outline of an enduring lesson. The courage of those who had dared to resist, however futile their immediate goal stood, in ever starker contrast to the regime's savagery. Their sacrifice, though it could not save Germany from devastation, would one day help a new nation rise from the rubble, determined never again to let fear and fanaticism rule. Through the bitter winter of 1944-45, the Reich that Heinrich Himmler now helped steer became a nation in freefall, a land where terror and desperation replaced any illusion of normal life. The July 20th conspirators were gone, but their failure haunted Germany like a phantom proof that even the bravest resistance could be crushed, yet also a whisper that the regime was mortal. While Allied armies advanced from west and east, the Nazi leadership clung to fantasies of revival, feeding the populace a diet of fear and delusion. The Eastern Avalanche. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet juggernaut seemed unstoppable. Operation Bagration had already destroyed Germany's Army Group Center the previous summer, and now in early 1945, the Red Army surged across Poland toward the Oder River, the final natural barrier before Berlin. Towns like Königsberg and Breslau endured brutal sieges, while columns of refugees, women pushing carts, children dragging suitcases fled westward through snow and ice. Many perished along the roads from hunger exposure or Soviet air attacks. Tales of atrocities by both sides circulated widely. Mass shootings, rapes, villages burned in reprisal. Fear of Soviet vengeance became a powerful weapon in Nazi propaganda, allowing Himmler to rally even the war-weary with the specter of Bolshevik horror. The Western Hammer. In the West, the Allies broke through the Siegfried Line and crossed the Rhine. American forces liberated Paris in August 1944 and then surged toward the German industrial heartland. British and Canadian troops swept through Belgium and the Netherlands, tightening the noose. Allied bombers turned cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden into seas of fire. The raids killed tens of thousands and left survivors wandering amid smoking ruins, their faith in any future dimming with every new onslaught. Himmler's fanatical response. Instead of seeking surrender, Hitler and Himmler doubled down on total war. They mobilized the Volkssturm, a desperate militia of boys barely 15 and men over 60. Armed with antiquated rifles or even Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, these ill-trained civilians were thrown against experienced Allied divisions. Posters proclaimed every German is a fighter, while mothers wept as their children were marched off to hopeless battles. Entire communities were stripped of their last able-bodied men, leaving behind only the elderly and the very young. Himmler poured dwindling resources into the Waffen-SS, elevating it above the regular army. Elite SS divisions received the best equipment and food, while the Wehrmacht starved. Regular officers who questioned these priorities risked arrest or execution. The result was a fractured military where loyalty to Hitler and the SS mattered more than competence or survival. Meanwhile, the SS unleashed ever greater brutality in the territories still under German control. As the Red Army approached, guards forced concentration camp inmates on death marches westward, shooting those who collapsed. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were annihilated. In Hungary and Slovakia, late-war deportations of Jews continued, even as defeat loomed an obsession with genocide that defied strategic sense. The werewolf fantasy. In Himmler's fevered imagination, the war need never truly end. He expanded the werewolf program, a clandestine guerrilla movement designed to operate behind Allied lines. Young recruits trained in sabotage, ambush, and assassination, learning to melt back into civilian life after striking. Radio broadcasts from werewolf stations promised a phantom army that would bleed the occupiers long after official surrender. Although the movement never reached the scale Himmler envisioned, small cells did commit assassinations and acts of sabotage well into 1946, especially in the rugged alpine regions where forests and mountains offered cover. A nation starving. For ordinary Germans, daily life became a grind of scarcity and fear. Food rations dwindled to starvation levels. Coal for heating was nearly impossible to find. Bombing raids forced families to live in crowded basements or underground shelters. Children scavenged for firewood among the ruins, while black market traders flourished in shadowy corners. Yet the Gestapo's presence remained relentless. A careless remark, wondering aloud if the war was lost, or criticizing Hitler could still bring arrest and torture. Survival demanded silence. Delusions in the bunker. In Berlin, Hitler retreated ever deeper into the labyrinth of his Führer bunker. His health deteriorated, tremors shook his hands, his posture bent, and his once fiery oratory collapsed into rambling monologues. Still, he raved about miracle weapons that would turn the TIE jet aircraft, rocket artillery, even fantastical superbombs. Himmler, ever the schemer, quietly opened secret channels to the West, hoping to negotiate a separate peace that might preserve the Reich as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. But Roosevelt and Churchill, united with Stalin in demanding unconditional surrender, ignored these overtures. Hitler learned of Himmler's furtive diplomacy only in April 1945 and exploded in rage, stripping his longtime ally of command. By then, it was too late for either of them. Soviet artillery already thundered on the outskirts of Berlin. Collapse on all fronts. In March and April 1945, Allied forces swept through the Rhineland, captured the Ruhr industrial region, and pushed into the heart of Germany. The once mighty Wehrmacht disintegrated. Exhausted soldiers surrendered in droves, their uniforms ragged, their faces hollow from hunger. The Volkssturm crumbled before American tanks and Soviet Katyusha rockets. Cities, declared fortresses, were reduced to rubble after feudal stands, their civilian populations decimated. As defeat became undeniable, the Nazi leadership fractured. Göring and others sought to position themselves as Hitler's successors, while some commanders opened discreet surrender talks with the Western Allies. Himmler himself attempted one last desperate negotiation with Swedish intermediaries, offering to capitulate to Britain and the United States, while continuing the fight against the Soviets. The proposal was summarily rejected. The Allies would accept nothing less than total simultaneous surrender. The bitter end. By late April, Soviet forces encircled Berlin. Street by street, building by building, they fought their way toward the Chancellery. Inside the bunker, Hitler raged at phantom armies and betrayed generals. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself, ending the life that had plunged the world into darkness. A week later, on May 8th, VE Day, Germany formally surrendered. Himmler, disguised as a common soldier, was captured by British troops and killed himself with a hidden cyanide capsule before he could be tried. Aftershocks of fanaticism. Yet the war's official end did not immediately silence Nazi violence. Scattered werewolf bands lingered in the forests of Bavaria and Austria, ambushing Allied patrols and assassinating local officials. In some alpine villages, mysterious gunfire echoed at night for months. It took years of policing and reconstruction to extinguish these remnants of terror. For ordinary Germans, the cost of the final year was staggering. Millions were dead, cities lay in ashes, and millions more faced displacement as borders shifted and refugees flooded west. Families searched the ruins for loved ones lost to bombing or the battlefield. Hunger and disease stalked the population through the harsh winter of 1945-46. Legacy of the Missed Chance. Historians would long debate what might have happened had the July 20th plot succeeded. Could an internal coup have shortened the war, saving countless lives and preventing the devastation of Central Europe? Might an earlier peace have limited Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? No one could know. What remained certain was that the failure of Operation Valkyrie prolonged both the suffering of Germany's people and the brutal occupation policies that defined the Reich's final year. Yet the conspirators' moral courage endured. In the ashes of post-war Germany, their memory became a cornerstone of democratic renewal. Streets, schools, and memorials bore the name of Klaus von Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters. Each July 20th, Germans gathered to honor those who had risked everything to oppose tyranny. Their sacrifice testified that even in a nation gripped by fear, conscience could not be completely extinguished. The Third Reich's last months thus formed a grim epilogue to the explosion at the Wolf's Lair. What might have been a swift end to the war became instead a drawn-out descent into chaos and cruelty. From the Volkssturm's doomed teenagers to the shadowy werewolf assassins, from the death marches of concentration camp prisoners to the bombed-out cities, the final year revealed the full cost of a regime that chose annihilation over surrender. And so, the story of Operation Valkyrie does not end merely with a failed coup. It ends in the ruins of Berlin, in the silent fields of Eastern Europe, and in the enduring reminder that courage and conscience, even when defeated, can light a path through the darkest chapters of history. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany was not only a smoldering ruin, but also a nation without a clear identity or future. The failed July 20th plot had left a strange legacy, proof that some Germans had resisted Hitler, yet also a reminder that their resistance had come too late to avert catastrophe. Amid the rubble of bombed-out cities and the arrival of Allied occupation forces, a new political order had to be imagined. And for a brief, flickering moment, it seemed possible that the seeds planted by the conspirators might guide the birth of a different Germany. In the chaotic weeks after the surrender, small groups of surviving resistors emerged from prisons and hiding places. They were an unlikely coalition: conservative aristocrats who had dreamed of a constitutional monarchy, moderate social democrats who envisioned a parliamentary republic, and devout Christians who had opposed the Nazi regime on moral grounds. Though many of their comrades were dead, these men and women believed their sacrifice demanded a new beginning. They saw themselves not as victims of fate, but as custodians of a moral mandate to rebuild. Internationally, the Allies viewed these would-be leaders with a wary eye. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had long insisted on unconditional surrender and were skeptical that any German faction, no matter how anti-Hitler, could be trusted to steer the nation toward democracy. The revelations of concentration camps at places like Buchenwald and Dachau only hardened that stance. Yet the existence of a homegrown German resistance complicated the narrative of collective guilt. It suggested that even under a totalitarian state, pockets of conscience had survived. Among the resistance figures who survived the war was Karl Gordeler, the former Leipzig mayor, and one-time chancellor-designate of the conspirators' planned government. Though arrested and executed before the war's end, his political allies quietly circulated his ideas for a post-Nazi constitutional framework, ideas that would influence the eventual drafting of West Germany's Basic Law in 1949. Others, like the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was hanged just weeks before liberation, became martyrs, whose writings about moral courage resonated deeply in the post-war spiritual vacuum. Still, the immediate post-war months were defined less by high ideals than by sheer survival. Millions of Germans were homeless. Railways lay twisted and broken. Farmland was cratered and burned. Cities like Berlin and Dresden were fields of stone. Hunger and disease were constant companions. Allied soldiers distributed emergency food rations, but shortages persisted. The black market became the only reliable source for basic goods, and cigarettes became a form of currency. For many, politics felt like a distant luxury when each day demanded the simple work of finding bread and shelter. Yet even in those desperate conditions, a shadow government of sorts began to take shape. Former resistance members, local civic leaders, and pragmatic administrators stepped forward to help the Allies stabilize daily life. In some towns, Allied officers quietly relied on these figures, knowing they possessed local legitimacy and a record of opposition to Nazism. Though the occupying powers, American, British, French, and Soviet, maintained ultimate authority, these early partnerships laid the groundwork for future self-rule. The question of what kind of government Germany should adopt provoked intense debate. Monarchists favored restoring a constitutional crown to unify the fractured nation, perhaps under Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, a grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II who had lived for years in the United States and maintained cordial ties with Franklin Roosevelt. Supporters argued that a symbolic monarchy could provide continuity without resurrecting the authoritarianism of the past. Others, including many social democrats and younger intellectuals, insisted that the monarchy was irretrievably tainted and that only a democratic republic could embody the lessons of the Nazi catastrophe. As these debates simmered, the Allies themselves were far from united. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 had left unresolved tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Churchill, increasingly wary of Joseph Stalin's ambitions in Eastern Europe, began to see value in a stable non-communist Germany that could serve as a buffer against Soviet expansion. American officials too recognized that a functioning German economy was essential for European recovery. These strategic calculations would soon shape the policies of the emerging Cold War. Meanwhile, remnants of Nazi ideology refused to die quietly. Scattered werewolf bands, those guerrilla fighters Himmler had trained to wage perpetual resistance, continued to harass occupation forces. In the dense forests of Bavaria and the Alps, Allied patrols sometimes faced ambushes from die-hard SS men who refused to surrender. Assassinations of local officials and surprise attacks on supply lines sowed fear in rural communities. Though these actions never threatened overall Allied control, they served as grim reminders that fanaticism still lurked beneath the surface. Inside the ruins of Berlin, the atmosphere was tense and surreal. Soviet troops occupied the eastern sector while American, British, and French forces administered the west. Barbed wire and checkpoints divided neighborhoods that had once flowed freely. The capital became a microcosm of the emerging global conflict. Communist propaganda blared from loudspeakers in the east, while jazz clubs cautiously reopened in the west, a fragile sign of cultural revival. The city's shattered skyline, half rubble, half reconstruction, symbolized the uncertainty of Germany's future. In the western zones, the US military government began a program of denazification, removing former party members from positions of influence. But as the need for skilled administrators grew acute, many low-level Nazis were quietly retained or rehabilitated. Ordinary Germans faced questionnaires about their past affiliations, and entire communities wrestled with questions of guilt and responsibility. Some clung to the comforting myth that the Nazi elite alone bore the blame. Others began a painful process of self-examination, acknowledging that silence and complicity had enabled the regime's crimes. The moral reckoning extended to the memory of the July 20th conspirators. In the immediate aftermath, many Germans viewed them with suspicion or indifference, influenced by years of Nazi propaganda that branded them as traitors. But as Allied trials at Nuremberg revealed the full scale of Nazi atrocities, public sentiment began to shift. The conspirators' willingness to sacrifice their lives in an effort to stop Hitler came to be seen not as treachery, but as a rare glimmer of honor. Schools eventually taught their story as an example of moral courage. Memorials and street names honored Klaus von Stauffenberg and his compatriots. The Allies, too, recognized the symbolic value of these resistors. American military broadcasts highlighted their heroism, contrasting their actions with the passivity of much of the population. British newspapers praised them as evidence that another Germany had existed, one that might yet be reborn, as a democratic partner rather than a perpetual enemy. For a nation desperate to reclaim dignity, the July 20th plotters offered a narrative of redemption. Yet the road to political renewal was neither quick nor smooth. In the Soviet zone, communist authorities moved rapidly to consolidate power, merging socialist and communist parties and establishing what would become the German Democratic Republic. In the West, the Allies encouraged the formation of political parties, but disagreements over economic policy and reparations created friction. The introduction of the Marshall Plan in 1947, offering American aid for European reconstruction, deepened the divide. The Soviet Union rejected the plan and forbade its satellites from participating, setting the stage for the split between East and West Germany. Throughout these years, memories of the failed coup remained a touchstone for those seeking a moral compass. Writers and philosophers debated its meaning. Was it too little too late? A gesture that could not redeem a nation complicit in genocide? Or was it a crucial assertion that conscience can survive even in a world of totalitarian control? For many younger Germans, the plotters became symbols of a responsibility to confront the past honestly and to build a society where such tyranny could never rise again. By the late 1940s, as West Germany began to emerge as a democratic state and East Germany hardened into a Soviet client, the legacy of July 20th found an enduring place in public life. Annual commemorations honored Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators. Their photographs appeared in school textbooks, their writings studied in universities. The black and white images of the Wolf's Lair explosion and the Bendler Block executions became emblems of both tragedy and hope. In this way, the shadow government imagined by the conspirators lived on, not in the form they had envisioned, but in the principles that guided the rebirth of a democratic Germany. Their dream of a nation reconciled with its neighbors and at peace with itself did not die in the Bendler Block courtyard. It simply waited for a future generation to claim it. Even as Germany struggled to rise from the ruins, the road to any real peace was tangled in hard realities and clashing ambitions. The men and women who had survived the Nazi nightmare faced not only the immediate task of rebuilding cities and feeding the hungry, but also the delicate work of negotiating Germany's place in a world that still viewed them with suspicion and grief. For those who remembered the July 20th conspirators, the question loomed: could their vision of a sovereign, humane Germany ever be realized? Or had the chance slipped away forever? Unconditional surrender versus German hopes. From the Allied perspective, the terms of peace had been set long before Berlin fell. At the Casablanca Conference in 1943, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill had declared that Germany must accept unconditional surrender. No partial deals, no negotiated settlements, only total capitulation. This was meant to ensure that the Allies could dismantle the Nazi war machine completely and prevent any resurgence of German militarism. But many Germans, even those who despised Hitler, dreamed of something less humiliating. Conservative nationalists hoped for a settlement that would preserve some territorial integrity and allow Germany to remain a major European power. They recalled the harsh Versailles Treaty after World War I and feared a repeat of the economic chaos and wounded pride that had once fueled extremism. These aspirations often collided with Allied policy, making early talks between occupation authorities and German civic leaders tense and uncertain. Early contacts and stalled negotiations. In the months after the surrender, informal meetings between Allied officers and surviving German administrators took place in shattered town halls and requisitioned military offices. Some German representatives, inspired by the ideals of the July 20th movement, proposed a government that would renounce expansionism and embrace democratic reforms while still maintaining a degree of sovereignty. Yet the Allies remained cautious. Reports of concentration camps, mountains of shoes, and skeletal survivors left American and British officials convinced that a sweeping purge was necessary before any self-government could be trusted. Soviet representatives, still furious over the immense losses inflicted by the Wehrmacht, demanded heavy reparations and the dismemberment of Germany's industrial base. Under such pressures, attempts at even modest autonomy for Germans stalled. The idea of an immediate peace built on partnership faded into the background as the occupying powers tightened their control. Tensions among the Allies. At the same time, cracks were widening between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin sought to secure a buffer zone of friendly or subservient states in Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia all felt the heavy hand of Moscow. Churchill, increasingly wary of Soviet expansion, began to wonder if a reformed Germany might one day serve as a bulwark against communism. American officials shared similar concerns as the wartime alliance frayed into the early Cold War. This shifting geopolitical landscape eventually softened Western attitudes toward German recovery. By 1947, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan, a massive aid program to rebuild war-torn Europe, including the western zones of Germany. Though intended primarily to prevent economic collapse and communist influence, the plan also provided a pathway for West Germany to rejoin the community of nations. The vision of the July 20th plotters, a Germany integrated into a peaceful Europe, gained unexpected traction, though in a context none of them could have predicted: the moral reckoning. For ordinary Germans, the larger diplomatic chessboard was overshadowed by an intense personal reckoning. Allied authorities initiated denazification programs requiring citizens to complete detailed questionnaires about their involvement in the Nazi Party. Former officials and teachers were interrogated, and prominent Nazis were barred from public service. The Nuremberg trials, broadcast to the world, exposed the depths of Nazi atrocities in chilling detail: systematic genocide, medical experiments, mass executions. These revelations forced many Germans to confront uncomfortable truths. Some clung to the belief that only Hitler and a small clique were guilty, insisting that they had been misled or powerless. Others began a slow, painful acceptance that silence and compliance had enabled the horrors. Churches, universities, and newspapers hosted public debates on guilt and responsibility, laying the groundwork for what Germans would later call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. Remembering the July 20th heroes. Amid this moral reckoning, the memory of the July 20th conspirators emerged as a fragile but vital source of national dignity. Initially, many Germans had viewed them as traitors. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted Stauffenberg and his allies as cowardly aristocrats who betrayed soldiers fighting at the front. But as the full scale of Nazi crimes came to light, attitudes shifted dramatically. Schools began to teach the story of the plot as evidence that another Germany had existed, one willing to sacrifice everything to stop the madness. Memorial services were held at the Bendler Block courtyard, where Stauffenberg and his comrades were executed. Streets and public squares were renamed in their honor. In West Germany's new capital of Bonn, political leaders invoked their courage as a moral foundation for the fledgling democracy. The men and women of July 20th became symbols of a conscience that the Nazis had tried but failed to eradicate. East-West divergence. Yet memory and politics diverged sharply as Germany split into two states. In the Soviet-controlled East, the new German Democratic Republic (GDR) honored communist resistance fighters but viewed the largely conservative July 20th group with suspicion. The GDR portrayed them as insufficiently revolutionary, even reactionary, and often omitted them from official histories. In contrast, West Germany embraced the plotters as proof that Germans could choose democracy and human rights over dictatorship. This divergence mirrored the broader ideological divide. West Germany, buoyed by Marshall Plan aid and guided by a new constitution, the Basic Law of 1949, built a federal democracy committed to individual freedoms and integration with Western Europe. East Germany became a socialist state under Soviet influence, with a centralized economy and tight political controls. Both states claimed the mantle of anti-fascism, but they remembered the past in strikingly different ways. Seeds of a democratic future. Despite these tensions, the spirit of the July 20th conspirators quietly influenced the shape of the new West German state. Their emphasis on the rule of law, constitutional limits on executive power, and reconciliation with Europe resonated with the framers of the Basic Law. Leaders like Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's first chancellor, frequently cited their example as a reminder that moral courage must guide political life. By the early 1950s, West Germany had begun its remarkable economic recovery. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, transforming ruins into bustling cities. Though the nation would wrestle for decades with the memory of its crimes, the democratic structures built in these years proved durable. In many ways, the July 20th conspirators, though long dead, had helped lay the moral groundwork for this rebirth, a legacy beyond borders. The impact of the failed coup extended beyond Germany's own borders. In occupied countries across Europe, the story of high-ranking Germans risking everything to kill Hitler challenged the stereotype of a monolithic, fanatically loyal Reich. It encouraged reconciliation between former enemies and provided a narrative that allowed Germans and their neighbors to imagine a future not defined solely by atrocity. Even today, historians debate what might have happened had the plot succeeded. Could a post-Hitler government have negotiated an earlier peace saving millions of lives and perhaps preventing the division of Europe? Or would the Allies, still committed to unconditional surrender, have insisted on fighting until Germany was fully subdued? No definitive answer exists, but the speculation underscores the plot's enduring significance. Closing reflections. In the end, the path to peace for Germany was neither quick nor gentle. It required not only the cessation of armed conflict, but also a profound confrontation with guilt, an acceptance of responsibility, and a commitment to a different kind of future. The July 20th conspirators failed to topple Hitler, yet their vision of a Germany reconciled with its neighbors and governed by law rather than fear found life in the democratic institutions that eventually arose. Their story reminds the world that even in the bleakest times, moral courage can illuminate a way forward. Though they did not live to see the Germany they hoped to create, the nation that emerged from the ashes bore in its best moments the unmistakable imprint of their sacrifice. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but Germany remained a fractured land. Rubble filled its cities, hunger stalked its people, and 4 foreign armies occupied its soil. Amid this devastation, questions that had haunted the July 20th conspirators lingered like smoke. Could Germany reclaim honor? Could it build a government strong enough to survive, yet humble enough never again to invite tyranny? And could the world ever trust it? A landscape of ruins. By mid-1945, the view across the country was one of staggering destruction. Entire neighborhoods lay flattened to their foundations. Rail lines and bridges had been blasted into twisted iron. In Cologne, only a single cathedral spire pierced a field of ruins. Berlin was a scarred wasteland where weeds sprouted through bricks and children scavenged for coal among the rubble. Starvation threatened millions. Bread rations shrank to a few ounces a day, and makeshift soup kitchens struggled to keep pace with endless lines of the gaunt and hollow-eyed. For ordinary Germans, survival eclipsed politics. Families bartered heirlooms for potatoes. Women patched together clothing from curtains and army blankets. Trümmerfrau and the rubble women became the quiet heroines of the hour, clearing debris stone by stone, often with babies strapped to their backs to make way for new streets and homes. Their stoic labor foreshadowed the civic resilience that would one day fuel the country's recovery. A nation under watch, Germany's fate now lay in the hands of the Allied powers. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union divided the country into 4 occupation zones, each administered independently. Berlin itself, a heap of ruins, was similarly split despite lying deep in the Soviet sector. The Allies agreed on certain essentials: demilitarization, denazification, democratization. But unity ended there. The Soviet Union sought heavy reparations and a socialist system aligned with Moscow. Britain and the United States, while initially harsh in their policies, soon worried more about economic collapse and communist influence than vengeance. France, still nursing wounds from occupation, favored a weakened Germany, but lacked the resources to impose a long-term vision. These competing aims foreshadowed the tensions of the coming Cold War. The question of how to treat Germany became the question of how Europe itself would be governed in the post-war era. Trials and reckonings. Meanwhile, the Allies undertook a monumental legal and moral project, the Nuremberg Trials. Beginning in late 1945, leading Nazi officials faced prosecution for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The proceedings, meticulously documented and broadcast, revealed the full horror of the regime, death camps, medical experiments, mass executions. Germans who had long claimed ignorance confronted photographs of skeletal survivors and testimony of systematic murder. These revelations ignited a painful national reckoning. Many struggled to reconcile their daily lives under Nazi rule with the atrocities committed in their name. Some clung to the belief that a small clique had misled the nation. Others, especially younger Germans, recognized the collective responsibility of silence and acquiescence. Churches, universities, and civic groups debated the nature of guilt. Out of this anguish grew the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with the past which would shape German identity for decades. Searching for a political path. While the Allies held ultimate authority, they soon recognized the need for German participation in governance. Local councils formed to manage food distribution, policing, and basic services. These grassroots efforts often drew on individuals who had opposed Hitler or maintained professional independence during the dictatorship. Former members of the July 20th Circle, those who had survived prisons and camps, quietly offered advice and legitimacy. The political ferment was intense. Old parties like the Social Democrats re-emerged, while new ones, most notably the Christian Democratic Union, sought to unite Catholics and Protestants in a centrist pro-democracy coalition. Intellectuals debated whether Germany should adopt a strong federal system to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Hitler's rise. Though the process was messy and uneven across occupation zones, a democratic ethos slowly took root in the western sectors. Diverging destinies, east and west. In the Soviet zone, a different experiment unfolded. Communist authorities merged socialist and communist parties into the Socialist Unity Party, laying the groundwork for a one-party state. Land reforms, redistributed estates to peasants and industry, was nationalized. Political dissent was quickly stifled. While some welcomed the promise of social equality, many sensed that a new form of authoritarianism was replacing the old. In the West, the American and British zones gradually shifted from punishment to reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1947, provided billions in aid to revive the European economy, including West Germany's shattered infrastructure. Railroads were repaired, factories reopened, and the black market slowly gave way to a regulated economy. By the early 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, began to transform cities of ruins into hubs of trade and innovation. The divergent policies hardened into a geopolitical divide. In 1949, two German states were officially born: the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, in the west, with Bonn as its capital, and the German Democratic Republic, GDR, in the east, governed from East Berlin. The Berlin Wall had not yet risen, but an ideological frontier already sliced through the heart of Europe. The conspirators' lingering influence. Amid these changes, the legacy of the July 20th conspirators gathered new significance. In West Germany, leaders such as Chancellor Konrad Adenauer invoked their memory as moral foundation for the young democracy. Schoolchildren learned of Klaus von Stauffenberg and his comrades as proof that not all Germans had embraced tyranny. Monuments were erected at the Bendler Block, where they had faced the firing squad, and annual commemorations honored their sacrifice. East Germany, by contrast, offered only muted recognition. The regime celebrated communist resistance fighters while portraying the largely conservative aristocratic July 20th group as politically suspect. Yet even there, whispers of admiration persisted, particularly among intellectuals and church groups who valued the conspirators' moral courage. Healing and memory. The decades after the war saw Germany grapple continually with the memory of both its crimes and its resistors. Writers and philosophers asked difficult questions. Was the conspiracy too little too late? Could the death of one man, Hitler, really have changed the course of history? These debates reflected a society determined not to bury its past, but to wrestle with it. By the 1960s, a new generation demanded a fuller confrontation. Student movements criticized what they saw as their parents' evasions and called for deeper acknowledgement of responsibility. Trials of former camp guards and Gestapo officers reignited painful memories, but also reinforced democratic values: justice, transparency, accountability. Europe and the world rebuild. While Germany wrestled with its identity, Europe as a whole moved toward integration. The European Coal and Steel Community, founded in 1951, laid the groundwork for the European Union. West Germany, once an international pariah, became a key member, its economic strength vital to continental recovery. The vision of a peaceful, cooperative Europe, something the July 20th conspirators had desperately hoped for, began to materialize in ways they could scarcely have imagined. Abroad, the memory of German resistance helped soften attitudes toward the new West German state. Allied leaders highlighted the July 20th plot as evidence that Germany contained within it the capacity for moral renewal. This narrative eased the path for West Germany's integration into NATO in 1955 and its eventual role as a pillar of Western democracy. A cautious rebirth. By the early 1960s, West Germany stood transformed, a thriving economy, a stable democracy, and a society increasingly committed to remembering the darkest chapters of its past. Yet the lessons of July 20th remained ever relevant. Politicians and educators invoked the conspirators' example as a warning against complacency. Annual ceremonies at the Bendler Block served not only as memorials, but as reminders of the vigilance required to protect freedom. In the East, the GDR remained a tightly controlled socialist state until its own dramatic collapse in 1989. When the Berlin Wall finally fell reunified, Germany once again turned to the memory of the July 20th plot. Across the now whole nation, their courage was celebrated as part of a shared heritage transcending the ideological divides of the Cold War. From the ruins of 1945 to the vibrant democracy of the late 20th century, Germany's journey was long and painful. Yet woven through it all was the thread of conscience left by the men and women who dared to defy Hitler. They had failed to end the war, but they succeeded in proving that even in an age of terror, there are those who choose honor over fear. Their vision of a Germany at peace with itself and the world became slowly but unmistakably the foundation of the nation that emerged from the ashes. As West Germany entered the 1950s, the nation stood at a crossroads that demanded more than economic revival. It required a profound reshaping of political culture and social values. The Allied powers had ensured that the new federal republic would be founded on democratic principles, but it was up to Germans themselves to decide how to transform those principles into a living, resilient system. Many of the ideas once whispered by the July 20th conspirators, rule of law, constitutional checks on executive power, and reconciliation with neighbors, now re-emerged as the guiding lights of this rebuilding. Sweeping political reforms. The Basic Law of 1949. The new Constitution of the Federal Republic deliberately avoided the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. Power was carefully balanced between federal and state governments, and the office of Chancellor was strengthened to avoid the paralyzing gridlock that had plagued the interwar years. Fundamental rights, freedom of speech, assembly, and religion were enshrined not merely as political preferences, but as inviolable principles. Every article bore the imprint of a hard-won lesson: never again could a charismatic leader or extremist party bend the machinery of the state toward tyranny. Political parties sprang back to life, though, with an eye toward moderation. The Christian Democratic Union (CDU), a new force that transcended old religious divisions, soon dominated the political landscape under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. The Social Democratic Party (SPD) recovered from Nazi suppression and provided a vigorous opposition. Even smaller parties, from liberal Free Democrats to regional representatives of Bavaria, found space in the Bundestag, West Germany's new parliament. In the lively debates of Bonn, democracy became more than a document. It became a daily practice. Dismantling the Nazi legacy. While political institutions took root, the country confronted the lingering presence of former Nazis in civil service, education, and industry. The Allies' denazification programs initially sought to remove anyone with a Nazi past, but the sheer number of Germans who had been party members made a complete purge impossible. As the Cold War intensified, the United States and Britain quietly relaxed some restrictions, prioritizing stability and economic recovery over thorough justice. This compromise created moral tension. Survivors of persecution watched in dismay as former Nazis resumed positions as judges, professors, and corporate leaders. Yet the broader culture was slowly shifting. Public trials of concentration camp guards and Gestapo officials continued through the 1950s and 60s, keeping memory alive. Journalists uncovered hidden atrocities. Writers and filmmakers forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths. The spirit of the July 20th conspirators who had risked everything to halt the Nazi state hovered over these debates, a silent demand that Germany never again look away from its darkest deeds. Social renewal and civic life. Economic revival. The so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, brought prosperity that helped stabilize democracy. Marshall Plan aid, combined with currency reform and industrial investment, transformed bombed-out cities into bustling centers of trade and innovation. Families that had once queued for bread now bought radios, bicycles, and eventually the new Volkswagen Beetles that became symbols of recovery. Prosperity alone, however, did not guarantee a free society. Civic education programs flourished, emphasizing democratic values and the responsibilities of citizenship. Schools incorporated the history of the Nazi era and the story of the July 20th plot into their curricula. Memorials rose not only to the victims of the Holocaust, but also to the men and women who had resisted Hitler from within. These reminders served as quiet guardians of conscience, encouraging young Germans to see freedom as a trust they must actively defend. Relations with the world. Internationally, West Germany sought to rebuild trust through humility and cooperation. Adenauer pursued reconciliation with France, the nation's historic rival, signing the Élysée Treaty of Friendship in 1963. West Germany joined the European Coal and Steel Community, a precursor to today's European Union, linking its key industries with those of its neighbors to make future war nearly unthinkable. These steps mirrored the conspirators' dream of a Germany at peace with Europe, not dominating it. West Germany also made the painful decision to acknowledge and compensate victims of Nazi persecution. In 1952, the government signed a landmark agreement with Israel to provide reparations for Holocaust survivors, a controversial but necessary act of moral responsibility. Though debates over the adequacy of these payments persisted, the gesture signaled a willingness to face the past honestly. Cultural reckoning. By the 1960s, a new generation pressed for deeper confrontation with history. University students demanded to know how their parents had lived under Hitler and why so many former Nazis remained in public life. Massive demonstrations questioned rearmament, challenged lingering authoritarian attitudes, and insisted on a full accounting of the Holocaust. Out of these protests emerged a vibrant culture of debate and self-critique, ensuring that the lessons of dictatorship would not fade into complacency. Art and literature reflected this reckoning. Writers such as Günter Grass explored themes of guilt and responsibility, while filmmakers like Volker Schlöndorff and Rainer Werner Fassbinder dissected the shadows of the past. Museums dedicated to resistance movements and memorials at former concentration camps turned public spaces into sites of education and reflection. The July 20th conspirators, once condemned as traitors, were now celebrated in plays, biographies, and state ceremonies as symbols of moral courage. The Eastern counterpoint. Across the Iron Curtain, East Germany followed a different trajectory. The ruling Socialist Unity Party claimed anti-fascism as its founding myth, portraying the GDR as the true heir of the anti-Nazi struggle. Yet it gave only grudging recognition to the largely conservative July 20th conspirators, preferring to honor communist partisans. While East Germany also experienced economic growth in the 1950s, political freedom remained sharply limited. Secret police surveillance, censorship, and the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 testified to a system that had simply exchanged one form of authoritarianism for another, a legacy that endured. Despite the division of the nation, the influence of the July 20th plotters reached across both Germany's and beyond. Their failed but courageous attempt provided an enduring answer to the question of German conscience. West German leaders regularly invoked their names when warning against extremism of either right or left. Annual commemorations at the Bendler Block drew presidents, chancellors, and foreign dignitaries, each speech affirming that democracy requires constant vigilance. For ordinary citizens, these ceremonies served as reminders that freedom was not a gift from the Allies or the result of economic success. It was a responsibility rooted in the sacrifices of those who had resisted tyranny. Schools encouraged students to debate the moral dilemmas the conspirators had faced. Was it justifiable to kill a dictator to save a nation? Could patriotism demand betrayal of a sworn oath? These discussions kept the memory of resistance alive as a living ethical challenge rather than a static monument, preparing for an uncertain future. By the early 1960s, West Germany had regained a respected place in the international community. It joined NATO, became a driving force in European integration, and built one of the world's strongest economies. Yet leaders understood that democracy was never guaranteed. The echoes of 1933 economic anxiety, populist anger, and political polarization remained cautionary tales. Policymakers emphasized consensus building and the protection of minority rights, determined to avoid the fractures that had once destroyed the Weimar Republic. The July 20th conspirators, though long dead, thus became silent partners in the Federal Republic's success. Their insistence on moral action, even in the face of certain death, inspired a political culture that valued principle over expedience. Each year, as officials laid wreaths at the site of their execution, the message resonated anew. Liberty survives only when individuals are willing to defend it, even at the greatest personal cost. By the close of the 1950s, West Germany had transformed itself from a pariah state into a vibrant democracy and economic powerhouse. Yet its leaders never forgot the lesson written in blood on July 20th, 1944, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. In the quiet courtyards of Berlin, where Stauffenberg and his comrades felt visitors from around the world could read the inscription, "You acted as if you might succeed, but you were ready to act even if you could not." Their courage had not ended the war, but it had helped shape the peace. The Germany rising from the ashes carried their imprint in its constitution, its conscience, and its enduring commitment to human dignity. By the dawn of the 1960s, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, had achieved an economic and political stability that would have seemed impossible amid the ruins of 1945. Yet the nation's leaders understood that prosperity alone could not heal the deep moral wounds left by Nazism. They faced a continuing challenge to shape a society in which democratic ideals were not only written into the basic law, but also lived daily by its citizens. In this effort, the lessons of July 20th, 1944 remained a constant guide. A constitution with a conscience. The framers of West Germany's basic law had deliberately created a political system designed to resist authoritarianism. Federalism dispersed power among the lender states, while proportional representation encouraged coalition governments and compromise. Crucially, the Constitution included what came to be known as the Eternity Clause, declaring that certain fundamental rights, human dignity, democracy, the rule of law, could never be amended or abolished. This provision was a direct response to the way the Nazis had manipulated Weimar's constitution to seize absolute power. Parliamentary democracy soon became routine, but never complacent. Debates in the Bundestag often invoked the memory of the resistance. Lawmakers reminded each other that the checks and balances they defended were not mere legalisms. They were the hard-won fruits of sacrifice by those who had died resisting tyranny. The July 20th conspirators had shown, as Chancellor Konrad Adenauer frequently observed, that there is no higher duty than to conscience. Building a culture of responsibility, economic growth. Wirtschaftswunder. The economic miracle provided the resources to rebuild cities and lift millions out of poverty. New apartment blocks replaced the ruins and factories roared with productivity. But policymakers knew that material success was not enough. Schools introduced comprehensive civic education programs that examined the rise of Nazism, the Holocaust, and the moral dilemmas of resistance. Teachers encouraged students to debate the meaning of loyalty, duty, and justice. Young people were asked to wrestle with difficult questions. What would you have done in 1933? Could you have risked your life to oppose a murderous regime? These discussions kept alive the spirit of Stauffenberg and his comrades as a living challenge, not a distant legend. Remembering in stone and ceremony. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, memorials to the July 20th plotters multiplied. The Bendler Block courtyard in Berlin, where Stauffenberg and others were executed, became a national site of reflection. Annual ceremonies there drew presidents, chancellors, and foreign dignitaries. Wreaths were laid, and speeches reminded the public that democracy requires constant vigilance. Streets and schools across West Germany were renamed for Klaus von Stauffenberg, Ludwig Beck, and other conspirators, ensuring that their names remained part of daily life. Cultural portrayals also deepened public understanding. Plays, novels, and eventually films explored the motivations of the plotters, portraying them not as flawless heroes, but as complex human beings, patriots, conservatives, Christians, and sometimes reluctant revolutionaries who recognized that obedience to Hitler had become a crime against humanity. This nuanced remembrance encouraged citizens to see resistance as an act of moral reasoning rather than mere political calculation. Shifting generations, sharpening questions. As a new generation came of age, these lessons took on fresh urgency. In the late 1960s, student movements erupted across West Germany, demanding a more thorough confrontation with the Nazi past. Young activists accused their parents of silence and complicity. Demonstrations filled the streets of Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich, challenging not only lingering authoritarian habits, but also the presence of former Nazis in positions of influence. The July 20th conspirators became both inspiration and point of debate. Some students admired their courage, but criticized their conservative background, arguing that a more radical democratic movement might have arisen earlier. Others saw in them proof that moral action transcends ideology. Public debates grew heated, but the very fact of such arguments showed how deeply the ethos of responsibility had penetrated the national consciousness. East Germany's contrasting memory. Across the Iron Curtain in the German Democratic Republic, the official narrative was strikingly different. The communist government celebrated anti-fascist resistance, but primarily that of communist partisans and workers. The aristocratic military nature of the July 20th group did not fit the socialist myth. While East German citizens sometimes heard of Stauffenberg and Beck, their story was muted, framed as a belated and insufficient attempt to save a capitalist order. Yet even in the East, the tale of the bomb at the Wolf's Lair circulated quietly through churches and intellectual circles, inspiring those who yearned for a broader understanding of conscience and dissent. When the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, splitting families and friends, some East Germans drew courage from the memory of those who had once defied a totalitarian state. Foreign policy and reconciliation. Guided by Adenauer and later leaders, West Germany sought to anchor itself firmly within a peaceful Europe. The 1963 Élysée Treaty with France symbolized a historic reconciliation between ancient rivals. West German diplomats worked to repair relations with neighbors once devastated by Nazi aggression. Reparations agreements with Israel and Jewish organizations acknowledged the immeasurable crimes of the Holocaust, a gesture that many Germans found painful but necessary. These efforts reflected the conspirators' vision of a Germany that would be a constructive partner, not a predator in Europe. In speeches before the Bundestag, Adenauer frequently cited the July 20th plot as proof that another Germany had always existed, one that could now step forward to build a future based on cooperation and human dignity. Guarding democracy. Through the 1970s, the Federal Republic faced new challenges: the tensions of the Cold War, the shock of the 1973 oil crisis, and the threat of domestic terrorism from the Red Army faction. Yet the political system held firm. Successive governments, whether conservative or social democratic, maintained a commitment to civil liberties and parliamentary debate. Courts acted as vigilant defenders of constitutional rights, often citing the lessons of the Nazi period when striking down laws that threatened personal freedoms. The memory of July 20th remained a touchstone during these crises. Editorials and speeches reminded citizens that democracy could be lost if fear or anger eroded respect for law and human dignity. School children continued to visit the Bendler block and former concentration camps, their teachers urging them to see these sites not as relics, but as warnings. Reunification and a shared heritage. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany moved toward reunification, the legacy of the July 20th conspirators became a unifying thread. In both East and West, citizens recognized their story as a shared heritage that transcended Cold War divisions. Memorial events in the 1990s drew crowds from across the newly united Germany, affirming that the courage of 1944 belonged to all Germans. The reunified nation embedded these lessons in its political culture. The preamble to the updated Constitution invoked human rights and peace as core values. Schools across the former East Germany incorporated the July 20th narrative into their history curricula, and memorials were renovated or newly constructed. The conspirators' vision of a free, responsible Germany had finally become a national consensus, an enduring moral compass. Today, visitors to the Bendler Block courtyard stand before a simple bronze plaque bearing the names of the executed. Flowers and candles are often placed beneath it, tokens of gratitude for lives given in defiance of tyranny. Each July 20th, the German president delivers a speech honoring their sacrifice and reminding the nation that democracy is never guaranteed. The power of their example lies not in success they failed to kill Hitler, but in the clarity of their moral choice. They acted knowing the odds were impossible, believing that to resist was itself a duty. Their story teaches that the defense of human dignity sometimes requires the ultimate risk, even when victory seems out of reach. The arc of German history after 1945 can be traced like a river flowing from that single day at the Wolf's Lair. The July 20th conspirators could not halt the carnage of World War II, but their courage became the seed of a democratic Germany committed to peace, law, and the sanctity of the individual. From the ashes of dictatorship rose a nation determined to remember that freedom is never free, and that conscience, once awakened, can guide a people through even the darkest century. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Federal Republic of Germany had matured into a stable democracy and an economic powerhouse. Yet the shadow of its Nazi past and the memory of those who tried to stop it remained central to its identity. The July 20th conspirators had become permanent figures in national life, invoked in debates about justice, security, and the responsibilities of citizens in a free society. Their legacy offered both inspiration and warning as Germany navigated the challenges of the Cold War, domestic terrorism, and eventual reunification. Cold War crossroads. Germany's geographic position made it the fault line of global tension. West Germany, integrated into NATO, hosted American nuclear weapons and troops, while East Germany served as a crucial Warsaw Pact ally for the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, stood as a concrete reminder of division and oppression. Each year it grew taller, more heavily guarded, and deadlier to those who attempted escape. In West Germany, leaders frequently drew parallels between the moral courage of the July 20th plotters and the need to resist both communist authoritarianism and any temptation toward militaristic nationalism. Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, facing the delicate balance of deterrence and diplomacy, reminded citizens that our freedom is never without cost, echoing the conspirators' belief that conscience must guide political action even in the most dangerous times. Social change and public memory. The 1970s also brought internal turmoil. Left-wing radical groups like the Red Army faction RAF carried out bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations, claiming to fight perceived fascist remnants in government and business. While their ideology differed vastly from Nazism, Their violence forced West Germans to confront again the question of how a democracy should respond to internal threats. Politicians and journalists often invoke the July 20th conspirators as a contrast to men and women who had chosen moral resistance over terror, who risked death to save lives rather than take them. During these decades, public commemoration of July 20th grew more sophisticated. Television documentaries brought archival footage and survivor interviews to living rooms. School curricula expanded to include not only the basic story of the bomb plot, but also the philosophical and ethical debates it raised. Museums at the Bendler Block and the Wolf's Lair curated interactive exhibits encouraging visitors to grapple with questions of loyalty duty and civil courage. These programs made the conspirators' message tangible for a generation born long after the war. East German perspective. Across the wall, the German Democratic Republic maintained a carefully controlled narrative of anti-fascism that emphasized communist resistance. Yet ordinary East Germans were not immune to the power of July 20th. Dissident writers and church groups quietly celebrated Stauffenberg and his circle as proof that Germans from various walks of life, not just communists, had opposed Hitler. In Samizdat publications and private gatherings, intellectuals debated the moral lessons of the plot, drawing inspiration for their own subtle forms of resistance against the GDR's authoritarian regime. When peaceful protests in the late 1980s swelled into the movement that would topple the East German government, some demonstrators carried banners quoting Stauffenberg and other conspirators. To them, the message was clear: courage and conscience belonged to no single ideology or party. Toward reunification. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the rapid reunification of Germany in 1990 brought these parallel memories together. Leaders of the new unified state embraced July 20 as a shared national legacy, transcending the ideological divide that had separated East and West for decades. Commemorations were reimagined as symbols of unity, with representatives from all political backgrounds attending ceremonies at the Bendler Block. President Richard von Weizsäcker himself, a veteran of the war, captured the spirit of the moment in a 1990 address. The men and women of July 20th remind us that the strength of conscience knows no boundary between East and West, no limit of time or place. They are the inheritance of a united Germany. Continuing the reckoning, reunification did not end the process of coming to terms with the Nazi era. In fact, it intensified it. The newly integrated nation now faced the challenge of harmonizing historical education across the former East and West. Some in the East had grown up with a narrative that downplayed the bomb plotters, while others in the West had long honored them as national heroes. New textbooks and public programs sought to create a cohesive story that respected both perspectives while emphasizing the universal value of moral resistance. Memorial sites were expanded and modernized. Digital archives made documents, letters, and photographs from the conspirators widely accessible. Scholars continued to debate the motives of the plotters. Were they primarily driven by moral outrage, pragmatic fear of defeat, or a mixture of both? Rather than diminish their stature, these discussions highlighted their humanity and the complexity of moral choice in dark times. Global influence. The story of the July 20th plot also found resonance beyond Germany. Around the world, movements seeking to resist dictatorship cited Stauffenberg and his comrades as examples of principled defiance. From Eastern European dissidents challenging Soviet domination to activists in Latin America confronting military juntas, the idea that individuals could stand against overwhelming power even at the cost of their lives carried universal appeal. Films and literature brought the tale to global audiences. Historical studies examined the plot as a case study in civil-military relations ethics and the psychology of authoritarianism. Universities across Europe and North America included it in courses on human rights and political philosophy. In this way, the conspirators became not only German heroes, but figures of international moral significance. Lessons for democracy. As Germany entered the 21st century, the July 20th conspirators continued to serve as a moral compass. Politicians of all parties invoked them when warning against extremism, whether far-right nationalism or violent leftist radicalism. Educators used their story to illustrate that democracy is not self-sustaining, that it requires active, courageous participation by citizens willing to challenge injustice. The annual commemoration on July 20th remains a solemn event. The German president traditionally delivers a speech in the Bendler Block courtyard, where wreaths are laid and the names of the executed are read aloud. Soldiers of the modern Bundeswehr, sworn to defend a democratic constitution rather than a single leader, stand at attention, a living testament to how fully the German military has embraced the principle that loyalty to law and humanity outweighs obedience to orders. An unfinished journey. Despite decades of remembrance and education, the work of safeguarding democracy is never complete. Periodic surges of extremist rhetoric, xenophobia, and political polarization remind Germans of the fragility of the system their forebears built. Each new challenge, whether economic crisis, migration debates, or the rise of digital misinformation, brings fresh calls to recall the courage of 1944. Historians and civic leaders alike emphasize that the July 20th conspirators did not act because they were certain of success. They acted because their consciences demanded it. Their example teaches that resisting injustice is a moral imperative regardless of the outcome, a lesson as urgent today as it was amid the horrors of Nazi rule. The enduring flame. Walk through the Bendler Block courtyard on a quiet evening and you may hear only the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of Berlin traffic. Yet the bronze plaque and eternal flame speak volumes. Beneath the simple inscription honoring those who gave their lives for freedom lie the echoes of a nation's long journey from dictatorship to democracy. The men and women who died on July 20th, 1944 could not know that their sacrifice would help guide a reunited Germany more than half a century later, but their moral courage lit a beacon that continues to shine. The legacy of Operation Valkyrie proves that history is not only shaped by victors or by those who live to see their triumphs. Sometimes it is defined by those who fail outwardly, but succeed in planting an idea that outlives them, that conscience can defy terror, that honor can survive tyranny, and that a nation, however lost, can find its way back to humanity. In Germany today, united, democratic, and vigilant, that idea endures as alive and necessary as it was on the summer day when a briefcase bomb nearly changed the world. By the opening decades of the 21st century, Germany had become a unified democracy and an economic leader in Europe, a nation transformed from the rubble and guilt of 1945. Yet the echo of the July 20th plot remained vivid, shaping how Germans understood freedom, responsibility, and their place in the world. The conspirators who once seemed like tragic failures had become enduring symbols of moral courage, their influence visible in the country's political culture, military traditions, and civic life. Reunification and a shared memory. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the formal reunification of East and West Germany in 1990 brought together two societies with different historical narratives. West Germany had long honored the July 20th conspirators as national heroes. East Germany, while officially anti-fascist, had downplayed their conservative and aristocratic backgrounds in favor of celebrating communist resistance. After reunification, educators, historians, and politicians worked to integrate these perspectives into a single national memory. Textbooks in the former East were updated to include the story of Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters. National ceremonies emphasized that the courage to resist tyranny belonged to all Germans, transcending ideological divides. In this way, the legacy of July 20th became a bridge helping to knit together a once divided nation. Germany's modern democracy. Modern Germany carries unmistakable fingerprints of the July 20th ethos. The Bundeswehr, Germany's post-war military, is not merely a defense force, but an institution shaped by the principle of innere Führung, inner leadership, which teaches soldiers that loyalty to the Constitution and to human rights outweighs obedience to any single leader. Cadets study the Valkyrie conspiracy as a central case in military ethics, learning that the ultimate duty of a soldier is to conscience, not blind command. In politics, the Federal Republic remains vigilant against authoritarianism. Germany's constitution allows the government to ban parties that threaten the democratic order, a safeguard explicitly designed to prevent a repeat of the Weimar Republic's collapse. This militant democracy reflects the hard lesson that freedom requires active defense. Politicians across the spectrum, from conservatives to Greens, routinely invoke the July 20th conspirators when warning against extremism of either the far right or the far left. Confronting new extremism. The 21st century has tested these principles. Economic migration debates over European integration and the rise of populist movements have periodically stirred nationalist sentiment. Far-right groups have tried to exploit public anxiety, sometimes invoking distorted visions of German history. Yet each surge of extremism has prompted renewed reflection on the example of the July 20th resistance. Public officials, educators, and journalists frequently remind citizens that democracy is not self-perpetuating. Annual July 20th commemorations televised nationally underscore that freedom depends on individuals who are willing to oppose hatred and defend human dignity no matter the cost. In these moments, Stauffenberg's defiant cry, "Long live sacred Germany," resonates not as a relic of the past, but as a living challenge to complacency. Global recognition and influence. Beyond Germany's borders, the story of the Valkyrie conspirators continues to inspire. Scholars, human rights activists, and military academies worldwide study their actions as a model of ethical resistance. Films, biographies, and documentaries reach new audiences each decade, ensuring that the memory of those who stood against Hitler remains part of global historical consciousness. From democratic movements in Eastern Europe to civil society groups in authoritarian states, Stauffenberg's decision to act despite near certain failure has become a universal lesson in moral courage. Cultural reflections. German culture keeps the memory alive through literature, theater, and cinema. Plays revisit the tense hours in the Wolf's Lair. Novels imagine the inner struggles of the conspirators. Films like Valkyrie bring their story to an international audience. Museums and memorials, especially the Bendler Block in Berlin, welcome thousands of visitors annually. Interactive exhibits encourage young people to ask, what does it mean to resist? When is disobedience a duty? Artists and authors emphasize that these questions are timeless. The July 20th conspirators are not presented as flawless heroes, but as complex human beings, patriots, fathers, devout Christians, and skeptical aristocrats who chose conscience over survival. Their humanity makes their courage all the more compelling. The unfinished work of memory. Despite decades of education and commemoration, Germans continue to wrestle with their past. Holocaust remembrance remains a cornerstone of national identity, and debates about how best to honor victims and resistors alike remain vibrant. New memorials, digital archives, and school programs aim to ensure that as living witnesses pass away, the stories of both atrocity and resistance will endure. Each generation confronts the question anew. How can we safeguard democracy against the slow creep of authoritarianism? How do we recognize the point at which loyalty to the state becomes complicity in evil? These were the questions that haunted Stauffenberg and his allies, and they remain urgent today. A legacy beyond victory or defeat. The men and women of July 20th did not live to see a democratic Germany. Their coup failed and their deaths did not shorten the war. Yet their legacy defies the simple metrics of victory or defeat. They proved that even in a society gripped by terror, individuals could choose principle over fear. Their action planted a moral seed that helped shape the Federal Republic and eventually the reunited Germany. Visitors to the Bendler Block today encounter a quiet courtyard where a bronze plaque lists the names of those executed for the plot. On July 20th each year, the German president lays a wreath there, flanked by Bundeswehr soldiers who have sworn allegiance not to a ruler, but to the Constitution and the rights of all people. The ceremony is solemn but hopeful, a reminder that the sacrifices of 1944 continue to guide the nation. Closing reflections. The story that began with a single briefcase bomb in the wolf's lair ultimately reshaped an entire nation. The conspirators' failure prolonged the war's agony, but their courage helped forge the moral foundation of modern Germany. Their vision, a Germany governed by law, at peace with its neighbors, and faithful to human dignity, did not die with them. It survived in the hearts of those who rebuilt the country and lives on in the democratic institutions and vigilant civic culture of today. Operation Valkyrie was never only about killing Hitler, it was about reclaiming Germany's soul. In that sense, the conspirators succeeded. They proved that conscience can endure even under the weight of terror, that honor can survive betrayal, and that a nation can rise from its darkest hour to embrace freedom and responsibility. More than 7 decades later, their example continues to shine as both warning and beacon. A warning that tyranny thrives when good people remain passive, and a beacon that illuminates the path of moral courage for all who face injustice in any age.